Do you believe you are the master of your own mind? Think again. Why does a judge grant parole after lunch but deny it before? Why do we fear a terrorist attack more than a car crash, despite the statistics? It turns out, your intuition is often a stranger to logic. From the invisible gorilla to the illusion of skill in the stock market, our brains are wired to jump to conclusions. What if the voice in your head is actually a lazy storyteller? Are you ready to uncover the hidden machinery that drives every decision you make? In Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman explores the two systems that drive the way we think. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and emotional, while System 2 is slower, more deliberative, and more logical. The narration reveals how these systems shape our judgments, leading to cognitive biases like the availability, heuristic, and loss aversion. It explains why we struggle with statistics, how we substitute easy questions for hard ones, and why our remembering self often overrules our experiencing self. This exploration challenges the assumption that humans are rational agents, offering a profound new understanding of the mind. Ready to go deeper? Here's the extended summary of Thinking Fast and Slow. The primary goal of this exploration is to enrich the vocabulary we use when we talk about the judgments of others. It is a simple fact of life that it is far easier and often more enjoyable to identify the mistakes of our colleagues than to recognize our own. Daniel Kahneman focuses on the proverbial office water cooler because he believes that intelligent gossip is a powerful motive for self-criticism, more powerful even than New Year's resolutions. But to gossip intelligently or to diagnose our own missteps, we need precise language. Just as a physician must learn the names of countless diseases to treat patients effectively, we need a richer vocabulary to understand the mind. We need to label our biases. This work stems from a long collaboration between Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They began with a fundamental question: are people good intuitive statisticians? While we are all natural grammarians, effortlessly following the rules of language without thinking about them, it turns out we are terrible intuitive statisticians. Even experts fail to apply statistical principles to realistic scenarios. We rely instead on mental shortcuts or heuristics. Consider the example of Steve, a man described as shy, helpful, and tidy. Is he more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? Most people instantly say librarian because he resembles the stereotype. In doing so, they ignore the statistical reality that there are vastly more farmers than librarians. This is a bias born from resemblance. Similarly, we fall prey to the availability heuristic. We judge the frequency of an event by how easily we can recall instances of it. This is why we might believe the letter K appears more often as the first letter of a word than the third, simply because it is easier to think of words that start with K. It is also why media coverage of dramatic events distorts our perception of risk. We recall the sensational headlines and assume those events are more common than they truly are. In the past, social scientists believed human error was driven largely by emotion, fear, affection, or hatred. Kahneman and Tversky challenged this dogma by showing that errors are actually built into the machinery of cognition. Even when we are calm, our minds simplify complex tasks in predictable, often flawed ways. However, not all intuition is flawed. It is important to distinguish between the expert intuition of a chess master, which is born of recognition and prolonged practice, and the snap judgments we make when we lack expertise. When we do not know the answer to a hard question, we often substitute an easier one. An investment officer might buy stock in Ford not because the financial data is sound, but simply because he likes the cars. He substitutes the difficult question, is the stock underpriced, with the easier emotional question, do I like this company? To understand these processes, we must look at the two distinct modes of the mind, which Kahneman personifies as System 1 and System 2. System 1 operates automatically and quickly, with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. It is the part of your mind that instantly detects hostility in a voice, completes the phrase bread and with butter, or understands a simple sentence in your native language. It includes both innate survival skills and learned associations that have become second nature through practice. System 2, in contrast, allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, including complex computations. This is the conscious reasoning self, the you, that makes choices and decides what to think about. When you solve a math problem like 17 multiplied by 24, you are engaging System 2. This mode is not just a metaphor for deep thought, it is physically demanding. Intense mental work causes your pupils to dilate, your heart rate to increase, and your muscles to tense up. A crucial limitation of System 2 is its finite budget of attention. Because effortful tasks require concentration, they interfere with one another. You cannot perform a difficult calculation while navigating heavy traffic, because your brain simply cannot handle both demands simultaneously. This limitation leads to a phenomenon known as inattentional blindness. In the famous invisible gorilla experiment, participants focused so intently on counting basketball passes, a System 2 task, that half of them failed to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking right across the court. As the study reveals, we can be blind to the obvious, and we are also blind to our blindness. While we identify with System 2 as the seat of our agency, it is actually System 1 that is the hero of our mental life. System 1 runs continuously, generating a stream of suggestions, impressions, and feelings. Most of the time, the lazy System 2 simply endorses these suggestions with little modification, turning them into beliefs and actions. System 2 only steps in when System 1 runs into a problem it cannot solve, or when we need to exert self-control to suppress a habit. This division of labor is generally efficient, but it leaves us vulnerable to illusions. Consider the Muller-Lyer illusion, where two lines of equal length appear different because of the fins attached to their ends. Even after you measure the lines and your System 2 knows they are equal, your System 1 will continue to see them as different. You cannot decide to unsee the illusion. You can only learn to mistrust your initial impression. This applies to cognitive illusions as well as visual ones. Since we cannot turn off System 1 or maintain constant, exhausting vigilance with System 2, the best we can do is learn to recognize high-stakes situations where our intuitive machinery is likely to fail us. To understand why maintaining this vigilance is so difficult, we must clarify the nature of the characters in our story. It is important to note that System 1 and System 2 are not physical entities. You will not find them residing in specific regions of the brain. They are useful fictions, nicknames that allow us to discuss the mind's quirks without getting bogged down in complex biological descriptions. We use these labels because the human mind is naturally attuned to stories about active agents. It is far easier to understand the sentence, "System 2 got lazy," than to describe the abstract fluctuations of voluntary attention and working memory. In the drama of our lives, System 2 believes itself to be the hero and the decision-maker. In reality, it is often a supporting character who merely thinks it is in charge. Its defining feature is that its operations are effortful. It only steps in when a task requires deliberate self-control or complex computation. If you want to experience this effort physically, consider the add one task. Imagine reading a 4-digit number, such as 5,294, and to a steady beat, reporting a new number where each digit is increased by 1, resulting in 6,305. If you attempt this for a series of numbers without breaking rhythm, you will feel a distinct strain. This is System 2, working at full capacity. This mental exertion is not just a metaphor, it is physically measurable. Research into cognitive pupillometry reveals that the pupils of the eye act as a sensitive electricity meter for the mind. When you engage in a casual conversation, your pupils remain stable, comparable to a comfortable mental stroll, but during a task like add one, they dilate significantly. The harder the brain works, the wider the pupils open, peaking at the moment of maximum effort. Interestingly, if a task becomes impossible and exceeds your cognitive capacity, the pupils instantly shrink. The system effectively shuts down and gives up. This intense focus comes at a steep price. When System 2 is operating at its limit, we become effectively blind to other stimuli. In experiments where participants were locked into a demanding calculation, nearly half failed to notice a flashing letter on the screen directly in front of them. This mirrors the famous invisible gorilla effect. When the brain's limited budget of attention is fully allocated to a primary task, it ignores secondary information to protect the priority activity. Because this level of exertion is expensive, the brain is designed to avoid it whenever possible. This principle is known as the law of least effort. In the economy of action, effort is a cost, and our natural tendency is to minimize it. If there are several ways to achieve a goal, we will instinctively gravitate toward the least demanding option. We rely on the automatic ease of System 1 for most of our day, reserving the heavy lifting of System 2 only for when it is absolutely necessary. This laziness is not a character flaw, but a biological necessity to conserve our limited mental energy. This conservation of energy manifests in physical ways. You might notice that you can easily maintain a conversation while taking a casual stroll, but if someone asks you to solve a complex multiplication problem mid-stride, you will likely stop walking entirely. This happens because self-control and deliberate thought draw from the same limited budget of effort. When your mental load becomes too heavy, the brain must prioritize, often shutting down other activities to maintain focus. This competition for resources leads to a state known as cognitive busyness. When System 2 is preoccupied with a demanding task, its grip on your behavior loosens. Research shows that if you are asked to memorize a 7-digit number and then offered a snack, you are significantly more likely to choose a slice of chocolate cake over a healthy fruit salad. Because your conscious mind is busy juggling numbers, it lacks the spare energy to restrain the impulsive sweet tooth of System 1. This suggests that willpower is not merely a character trait, but a finite physiological resource. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as ego depletion. Every time you suppress an emotional reaction, force yourself to focus, or make a difficult choice, you drain this shared pool of energy. Once the tank is low, you become less capable of self-control in subsequent tasks. One of the most striking demonstrations of this effect comes from a study of parole judges in Israel. Researchers tracked the judges' decisions throughout the day and found a disturbing pattern. Immediately after a meal, the judges granted parole requests about 65% of the time. However, as time passed and their energy waned, the approval rate dropped steadily, hitting nearly zero just before the next food break. When the brain is depleted by hunger and fatigue, it defaults to the path of least resistance. Denying parole is the safer, easier option that requires less active reasoning than justifying a release. Even when we are not physically depleted, our System 2 is often reluctant to exert itself, leading to what Kahneman calls the lazy System 2. We tend to place too much faith in our intuition because checking it requires work. Consider the famous bat and ball puzzle. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? For most people, the number 10 cents jumps into their mind immediately. It feels right. But it is wrong. If the ball were 10 cents, the bat would be $1.10, making the total $1.20. The correct answer is 5 cents. What is alarming is that more than 50% of students at elite universities like Harvard and MIT fail this test. They are certainly intelligent enough to solve the math, but they fail to pause and verify their intuition. This highlights a crucial distinction between intelligence and rationality. Intelligence measures the raw processing power of the mind, the ability to compute and reason when engaged. Rationality, however, is the willingness to engage that power. A person can have a high IQ but still be an intellectual slacker, content to accept superficial answers rather than doing the hard work of skeptical thinking. This distinction leads researchers Keith Stanovich and Richard West to separate the algorithmic mind, what IQ tests measure, from true rationality. A person can have a powerful algorithmic mind but fail to use it, relying instead on the automatic, effortless processing of System 1. This intuitive system operates as an associative machine. To understand how it works, imagine seeing two unrelated words side by side, bananas and vomit. Instantly, your mind creates a connection. You do not just read the words, you likely visualize a scenario where the fruit caused the sickness. You might even feel a mild wave of disgust or notice your face twisting slightly. This is associative activation. Your brain triggers a spreading cascade of ideas, memories, and emotions, creating a self-reinforcing pattern called associative coherence. It demonstrates that you think with your body, not just your brain, a concept known as embodied cognition. Most of this work happens silently, hidden from your conscious self. We now understand that memory is a vast network of linked ideas or nodes. When one idea is activated, it ripples out to touch many others. This mechanism drives a powerful psychological phenomenon called priming. If you have recently seen the word ET, you are far more likely to complete the word fragment, S-O-U-P, as soup rather than soap. You are primed for food-related concepts. But priming extends far beyond simple word games. It influences your physical actions and behavior in ways that can be unsettling. In a classic experiment known as the Florida effect, psychologist John Bargh asked students to assemble sentences using words associated with the elderly, such as gray, wrinkle, and Florida. When the students left the room, they walked down the hallway significantly slower than those in a control group. The mere idea of old age acted as a prime, unconsciously altering their physical speed. This is the ideomotor effect. Remarkably, this connection is reciprocal. Just as ideas drive actions, actions drive ideas. In another study, participants who were instructed to walk slowly were quicker to recognize words related to old age. Similarly, if you hold a pencil between your teeth, forcing your face into a smile, you will find cartoons funnier than if you hold the pencil with your lips, which forces a frown. Your physical gestures dictate your emotional state. These invisible primes shape our decisions in the real world. Voters whose polling stations are located inside schools are more likely to support education funding. Even the subtle presence of money, like a screensaver of floating dollar bills, can make people more independent and persistent, but also more selfish and socially distant. We like to believe we are the autonomous authors of our judgments, but the research suggests we are often strangers to ourselves, constantly nudged by environmental cues we never even notice. At the heart of these unconscious influences lies a continuous assessment carried out by System 1. It constantly monitors the environment to determine whether things are going well or if extra attention is required. This is the scale of cognitive ease versus cognitive strain. When things are going smoothly, when information is clear, familiar, or presented in a legible font, you experience cognitive ease. In this state, you are likely to be in a good mood, trust your intuition, and feel that the current situation is safe. However, you are also more superficial in your thinking and more prone to logical errors. Conversely, when you encounter confusion, difficult language, or a hard-to-read font, you experience cognitive strain. This strain acts as a psychological red alert that mobilizes System 2. You become more vigilant and analytical, stepping away from intuition to engage in effortful thinking. While this reduces errors, it also stifles creativity. This mechanism has profound implications for how we determine what is true. System 1 does not easily distinguish between familiarity and truth. If a statement feels easy to process, we are biased to believe it. This is why repetition is such a powerful tool for persuasion. In a study titled Becoming Famous Overnight, psychologist Larry Jacoby showed that people often mistake a name they have seen before for the name of a celebrity, simply because the familiarity generates a sense of pastness. If you want to be persuasive, you must minimize cognitive strain for your audience. Use high-contrast colors and simple language. The author warns that couching familiar ideas in pretentious vocabulary is often taken as a sign of poor intelligence, not brilliance. Even rhyming helps. Aphorisms that rhyme are consistently judged as more insightful than those that do not. However, cognitive ease is not always the goal. If you need to avoid logical traps, a little strain is actually helpful. In one experiment, students performed significantly better on the cognitive reflection test when the questions were printed in a faint, difficult-to-read font. The sheer struggle to read the text forced them to abandon their lazy, intuitive responses and engage their analytical system too. Ultimately, our preference for cognitive ease is biological. Psychologist Robert Zajonc called this the mere exposure effect. We naturally develop affection for things we see repeatedly. In the wild, novelty often signals danger, while a repeated stimulus that causes no harm eventually becomes a safety signal. This link between ease and safety also explains why mood affects our thinking. A good mood signals that the environment is safe, allowing us to let our guard down and rely on intuition. This boosts creativity, but lowers vigilance. Sadness or anxiety, by contrast, signals a problem, triggering the more cautious, effortful processing of System 2. While mood sets the general stage for how we process information, the primary tool we use to measure our understanding of the world is surprise. Surprise is the emotional response to a violation of expectation. Some expectations are active, like waiting for a specific friend to knock on the door, but most are passive. We do not consciously wait for our car to start every morning, but we are certainly surprised if it fails to do so. System 1 is remarkably quick at updating its sense of what is normal to accommodate these surprises. Kahneman refers to this as norm theory. If you bump into an acquaintance in a random city abroad, you are shocked. However, if you run into them again in a different city shortly after, it feels significantly less surprising. Your mind has instantly updated its model to categorize this person as the acquaintance who shows up when we travel. A single occurrence can effectively create a new norm, making the world feel predictable again. This flexibility relies heavily on associative coherence. We constantly scan for patterns that fit the current context, often glossing over factual errors if the story feels right. Consider the question: how many animals of each kind did Moses take into the ark? Most people instantly answered 2, failing to notice that it was Noah, not Moses, who built the ark. This is known as the Moses illusion. Because Moses fits the general biblical context, System 1 accepts the name without checking the details. If the question had substituted George W. Bush for Moses, the illusion would vanish immediately because the association is too jarring. Our minds are also desperate to find causes. We do not simply observe events, we instinctively construct stories to explain them. If we read that Fred's parents arrived late and Fred was angry, we automatically assume the lateness caused the anger, even if the text never explicitly links them. This drive for causal coherence is so strong that we often attribute contradictory outcomes to the same cause. Kahneman notes how financial news might cite a major political event to explain a rise in the market, and then use the exact same event to explain a drop later that afternoon. We crave a world that makes sense, even if we have to invent the connections to satisfy that craving. This storytelling instinct leads us to jump to conclusions. System 1 is a machine for suppressing ambiguity. When faced with a shape that looks like the letter B in a string of text, or the number 13 in a list of figures, we see only the interpretation that fits the context. We are rarely aware that there was a choice to be made at all. Psychologist Daniel Gilbert argues that to understand a statement, we must first attempt to believe it. Doubt and unbelieving are the work of the effortful System 2. Consequently, when System 2 is tired or distracted, we become much more likely to believe whatever we are told. This leads to a strong confirmation bias, where we seek only evidence that supports our existing views and ignore information that contradicts them. Finally, this drive for coherence creates the halo effect. We tend to like or dislike everything about a person based on a single trait. If we think someone is handsome or personable, we automatically assume they are also generous and smart. This simplifies our world, making our judgments feel consistent, even if they are factually wrong. The order in which we observe these traits matters immensely. In a classic study by Solomon Asch, participants viewed a person much more favorably when positive traits, like intelligent, were listed before negative ones, like stubborn. The initial positive impression colored the interpretation of what followed. Stubbornness in an intelligent person is often seen as justified determination, whereas intelligence in an envious person makes them seem dangerous. This demonstrates how first impressions can effectively waste subsequent information, as System 1 suppresses ambiguity to maintain a consistent emotional narrative. The author illustrates this through his own experience grading student essays. He noticed that when he graded all of a single student's answers in a row, the score he gave to the first essay biased his evaluation of the second. If the first was excellent, he tended to give the student the benefit of the doubt on a weaker second answer, creating a spurious consistency that felt satisfying but was intellectually dishonest. To fix this, he adopted a new procedure, grading every student's answer to the first question before moving on to the second, while keeping the names hidden. This revealed a frustrating inconsistency in student performance, and while his confidence in his grading felt lower, the quality of the evaluation was undoubtedly higher. The earlier comfort he felt was simply System 2 lazily accepting the coherent story created by System 1. This experience points to a vital principle: the need to decorrelate error. To derive accurate information from multiple sources, those sources must be independent. This is the secret behind the wisdom of crowds. If you ask a large group to estimate the number of pennies in a jar, their individual errors tend to average out to 0, producing a remarkably accurate result. However, this magic only works if the observers do not influence one another. If they communicate, they share biases, reducing the diversity of opinion. This is why police separate witnesses before taking statements, and why effective meetings should require participants to write down their positions before opening the floor for discussion. This prevents the group from being swayed by whoever speaks first or most assertively. This tendency to ignore missing information leads us to a core concept of System 1, which the author calls WYSIATI, what you see is all there is. System 1 is an associative machine that only represents activated ideas. It cannot account for information it does not have. Instead, it excels at constructing the most coherent story possible from whatever limited evidence is currently available. If we are told a leader is intelligent and strong, we immediately infer they are good, without asking what we might be missing. System 1 prioritizes the coherence of the story over the quality or quantity of the data. This explains why we are often so confident in our judgments despite having very little evidence. We judge the truth of a belief based on how well the narrative hangs together, not on how complete the picture actually is. This mechanism has deep evolutionary roots. We possess an ancient capability to judge strangers instantly. Studies show that System 1 evaluates 2 key traits in a single glance: dominance and trustworthiness. In the modern world, this instinct influences high-stakes decisions, such as elections. Research indicates that ratings of a candidate's competence, based on seeing their face for just 1/10 of a second, can predict election winners with surprising accuracy. We often vote for the face that System 1 instinctively labels as competent, proving that even in complex political landscapes, we are heavily influenced by the automatic, surface-level assessments of our intuitive mind. Underlying these rapid judgments is a capability called intensity matching. System 1 excels at translating values across unrelated dimensions. For instance, we can intuitively match the loudness of a sound to the severity of a crime, or equate a child's precocious reading ability to a very tall physical height. This cross-scale mapping allows us to feel a sense of fit or injustice between completely different categories, but it is often statistically flawed. This process is fueled by what is known as the mental shotgun. While we might intend to focus on a single, specific task, System 1 constantly performs routine assessments and computes more information than is requested. It scatters its attention. If you are asked to judge whether the words vote and goat rhyme, you might hesitate slightly because your brain automatically processes the conflicting spelling, even though the task was only about sound. When the mental shotgun combines with intensity matching, we arrive at a phenomenon called substitution. When faced with a difficult, complex question, System 1 often answers an easier, related question instead, usually without us noticing the switch. This is why we rarely feel stumped. If asked, "How happy are you with your life?" a complex assessment, we unknowingly substitute the heuristic question, "What is my mood right now?" This was vividly demonstrated in a study of students. When asked about their general happiness, there was little correlation with their dating lives. But when the order was reversed, asking about their dating lives immediately before asking about their happiness, the correlation became massive. The students substituted their emotional reaction to a specific part of their life for a broad assessment of their well-being. This is the affect heuristic in action. Our likes and dislikes determine our beliefs. If we like a policy or a technology, we naturally perceive its benefits as high and its risks as low. In this state, System 2 acts not as a critical monitor, but as an apologist for System 1, seeking information that confirms our existing emotions rather than challenging them. Our reliance on coherent stories over statistical reality becomes even more dangerous when dealing with data. Consider the law of small numbers. In a study of kidney cancer rates, the counties with the lowest incidence were found to be mostly rural and sparsely populated. System 1 immediately generates a causal story to explain this. Perhaps it is the clean living and fresh air of country life. However, the counties with the highest incidence of kidney cancer are also rural and sparsely populated. The common factor is not lifestyle, but population size. Small samples are far more likely to yield extreme outcomes, both high and low, than large samples. Yet, because our minds are designed to find causes rather than accept statistical noise, we invent explanations for events that are purely random. These extreme results are artifacts, observations produced entirely by the sample size rather than any underlying cause. The small population of a county neither causes nor prevents cancer. It merely allows the incidence to fluctuate wildly. Yet our minds crave a causal story. We pay attention to the content of the message, "Rural living is healthy," rather than the reliability of the data. This cognitive blind spot has expensive consequences. For example, the Gates Foundation once invested $1.7 billion into creating small schools. They based this decision on data, showing that small schools were significantly overrepresented among the highest-performing institutions. System 1 immediately constructed a coherent narrative. Small environments provide superior, personalized education. But the foundation missed the other half of the story. If they had looked at the worst-performing schools, they would have found that small schools were overrepresented there as well. Small schools are not necessarily better, they are simply more variable. By ignoring the law of small numbers, a fortune was spent chasing a statistical mirage. This happens because System 1 is designed to suppress ambiguity. It operates on the principle of what you see is all there is. When we see a pattern, we believe it represents the truth, rarely pausing to ask if the sample size is large enough to be reliable. Sustaining doubt is hard work for System 2. Sliding into certainty is easy for System 1. Even sophisticated researchers fall into this trap, frequently conducting studies with sample sizes so small that they have only a 50-50 chance of confirming their own hypotheses. We are simply not sensitive to the difference between a solid fact and a statistical fluke. This preference for causal explanations over statistical ones leads us to see order where there is only chance. During the Second World War, Londoners believed that German bombing patterns were targeted because some neighborhoods were hit repeatedly while others were spared. Statistical analysis later proved the hits were randomly distributed. But to the untrained eye, randomness often looks like clustering. We struggle to accept that an event can happen without a specific cause. We see the same illusion in sports. Fans, coaches, and players universally believe in the hot hand in basketball. The idea that a player who has made 3 shots in a row is more likely to make the next one. It feels undeniably true. Yet extensive analysis of thousands of shooting sequences has shown that the hot hand does not exist. Successes and misses are effectively random. But our associative machinery rejects this. We are too quick to perceive order in chaos, inventing skills and causes to explain what is often just the luck of the draw. This tendency to find false patterns is matched by another profound bias called the anchoring effect. It happens when we consider an unknown quantity before making an estimate. The mere suggestion of a number, even one that is clearly irrelevant, pulls our estimate toward it like a magnet. In a classic demonstration of this, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky built a rigged wheel of fortune that would stop only on the numbers 10 or 65. They recruited students, spun the wheel, and asked them to write down the number that came up. Then they asked 2 questions. Is the percentage of African nations in the United Nations higher or lower than that number? And second, what is your best guess of the actual percentage? The results were striking. Students who saw the number 10 estimated 25%. Those who saw 65 estimated 45%. A completely random spin of a wheel drove their answers apart by 20 percentage points. For a long time, researchers debated the mechanics of this effect. It is now understood that anchoring comes from 2 distinct processes in the mind. The first is a deliberate operation of System 2, known as adjustment. Imagine you are driving on a highway at 70 miles per hour, and you exit onto a city street. Your speed drops, but 50 miles per hour now feels incredibly slow, so you might fail to slow down enough. You anchor on the high speed and adjust downward, but the adjustment is insufficient. This happens in negotiations and arguments too. A teenager who agrees to turn down their deafening music might lower the volume to a level they think is a huge compromise, while the parent still finds it unbearably loud. The teenager anchors on the original volume and stops adjusting at the first point that feels reasonable. The second mechanism is an automatic priming effect of System 1. When you are exposed to a number, your associative memory immediately builds a world in which that number is the true value. If someone asks you if Gandhi was 144 years old when he died, you know the answer is no. But the number 144 triggers associations with old age. If you are then asked to guess his actual age, your estimate will be higher than if the anchor had been smaller. Your mind selectively retrieves memories and evidence that support the anchor, biasing your final judgment. We often like to believe that experts are immune to these tricks, but the data suggests otherwise. In one study, real estate agents were asked to value a house. They were given a booklet of information that included an asking price. Half the agents saw a price far above the market value. The other half saw one far below. Despite insisting that the listing price did not affect them, the agents' valuations were swayed by over 40%. Even more disturbing is a study involving German judges. They read a case about a shoplifter, then rolled a pair of dice that were loaded to show either a 3 or a 9. Immediately after the roll, they were asked to sentence the defendant. Those who rolled a 9 gave an average sentence of 8 months. Those who rolled a 3 gave only 5 months. A literal roll of the dice influenced a judicial decision by 50%. This phenomenon is everywhere in commerce. When a supermarket places a sign saying, "Limit of 12 per person" on soup cans, shoppers buy more than when there is no limit. The number 12 becomes an anchor, suggesting that the item is in high demand. In salary negotiations or car buying, the first number put on the table exerts a powerful gravity on the entire discussion. The best defense against a ridiculous anchor is not to counteroffer, which implicitly accepts the range, but to make a scene, to storm out or threaten to leave unless that number is taken off the table. You must actively engage System 2 to search for arguments against the anchor, rather than letting System 1 quietly validate it. Anchoring reveals a troubling dynamic between our two modes of thinking. While your conscious System 2 makes the final judgment, it relies entirely on data automatically retrieved by System 1. Because System 1 operates on the principle that what you see is all there is, it treats even random numbers as relevant information. System 2, often lazy or distracted, validates these biases without realizing it has been influenced. This reliance on immediate automatic retrieval leads us directly to another pervasive mental shortcut: the availability heuristic. When faced with a difficult statistical question like, "How frequent is this event?" we rarely consult actual data. Instead, we substitute a simpler question: "How easily can I think of examples?" If instances come to mind smoothly, we assume the event is common. If we struggle to recall any, we assume it is rare. The problem is that our memory is not a faithful statistical database. It is biased toward the vivid, the recent, and the personal. A celebrity divorce or a dramatic plane crash grabs our attention and remains easily accessible in memory, leading us to exaggerate how often these things happen. Meanwhile, silent, undramatic events, like deaths from asthma or strokes, get little media coverage and fade into the background, causing us to drastically underestimate their frequency. This bias creates real friction in our daily lives, particularly in collaborative efforts. Consider a study where spouses were asked to estimate their personal contribution to household chores. When you add up the percentages claimed by both partners, the total consistently exceeds 100%. This is not necessarily due to arrogance or lying. It is a product of availability. You vividly remember every time you took out the trash or washed the dishes because you were there. Your partner's efforts are far less available to your memory. Recognizing that there is usually more than 100% credit to go around can be a powerful way to diffuse tension in marriages and professional teams. Interestingly, the mechanism behind this heuristic is not just about the content of our memories, but the fluency with which we retrieve them. In a revealing experiment, researchers asked participants to list instances of their own assertive behavior. One group was asked to list 6 examples, while another group had to list 12. Logic suggests that the people who listed 12 examples would rate themselves as more assertive simply because they had generated more evidence. But the results showed the exact opposite. Listing 12 instances is mentally difficult. As the participants struggled to find that 10th or 11th example, their System 1 whispered a different conclusion. If I am having this much trouble remembering times I was assertive, I must not be a very assertive person. The struggle to retrieve the memory outweighed the memories themselves. This proves that the feeling of cognitive ease, or strain, is a data point in itself. This reliance on ease and emotion heavily warps our perception of risk. We tend to fear what is frightening rather than what is likely. This leads to the affect heuristic, a phenomenon where our likes and dislikes determine our beliefs about the world. As psychologist Jonathan Haidt famously noted, the emotional tail wags the rational dog. We construct a simplified world in our minds where the things we like have no costs, and the things we dislike have no benefits, shielding us from the messy trade-offs of reality. This reliance on emotion creates a sharp conflict between how experts and the public perceive risk. Experts typically define risk through objective metrics, such as the number of lives lost or years of life expectancy. However, researcher Paul Slovic argues that the public operates on a richer conception of risk. We instinctively distinguish between good deaths and bad deaths, or between voluntary risks, like skiing, and involuntary ones, like breathing polluted air. Slovic contends that risk is not an objective reality waiting to be measured, but a human invention used to cope with uncertainty. Because the choice of metric, such as deaths per million people versus deaths per $1 million, can completely change the evaluation, Slovic concludes that defining risk is ultimately an exercise in power. On the other side of this debate, legal scholar Cass Sunstein argues that public policy should be insulated from these emotional fluctuations. He warns against, quote, availability cascades, self-sustaining chains of events where a minor incident is amplified by media coverage, and availability entrepreneurs, until it triggers widespread panic. A classic example is the Alar scare in 1989, where a minor chemical risk on apples led to a media frenzy and massive economic losses. In these cascades, the emotional fluency of a story makes it appear far more urgent than its statistical reality. We suffer from probability neglect, focusing entirely on the vivid, tragic numerator, the scary story, while ignoring the denominator, which is the actual, often minuscule, probability of harm. This tendency to ignore statistics in favor of a compelling narrative isn't limited to public policy. It fundamentally shapes how we judge individuals. The author illustrates this with the Tom W. experiment. Participants are given a personality sketch of a graduate student named Tom, describing him as orderly, mechanical, and lacking empathy. When asked to rank the likelihood of his field of study, most people immediately place computer science or engineering at the top. They do this because the description matches their internal stereotype of those professions. This is the representativeness heuristic, judging the probability of an event based on how much it resembles a mental model. The error here is that the judgment completely ignores base rates, which are the actual frequencies of students in different fields. In the real world, there are vastly more students in humanities and social sciences than in computer science. Statistically, it is much more likely that Tom is a humanities student who happens to be tidy, rather than an engineering student who fits the mold. Yet even trained statisticians often fail this test. This happens because of substitution. When faced with a difficult question about probability, our automatic system 1 substitutes it with an easier question about similarity. We ask ourselves, how much does Tom look like a computer scientist, rather than how likely is it that Tom is a computer scientist? We see the character, we recognize the type, and we ignore the math. This is the same cognitive trap that led baseball scouts in the book Moneyball to judge players by their look, rather than their performance data. To judge accurately, we must discipline ourselves to look past the vivid description and respect the base rates. This failure to respect base rates is not just an automatic glitch, it is a failure of oversight. System 1 suggests the stereotype, and System 2, which is responsible for logical checking, lazily endorses it. Research has even shown that if you force people to frown while thinking, a physical act that triggers cognitive vigilance, they become less likely to ignore the base rates. But without that extra effort, we fall victim to the principle that what you see is all there is. We process available information as if it were the whole truth, building a coherent story around weak evidence while ignoring what we don't know. To discipline our intuition, the author suggests using Bayesian reasoning. While the math can be complex, the practical application is straightforward. Always anchor your judgment on the plausible base rate and question the diagnosticity of your evidence. Ask yourself, how much does this new information actually prove? If the evidence is weak or unreliable, your prediction should stay close to the base rate, no matter how good the story sounds. The conflict between a good story and logical probability is best illustrated by the famous Linda problem. Imagine a woman named Linda. She is 31, single, outspoken, and very bright. As a student, she majored in philosophy and was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice. Now, consider two scenarios. First, that Linda is a bank teller, and second, that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. When asked which is more probable, the vast majority of people, including graduate students in decision science, choose the second option. This is the quote, conjunction fallacy. Logically, the probability of two events occurring together cannot be higher than the probability of one of them occurring alone. If you visualize a Venn diagram, feminist bank tellers are merely a small subset of all bank tellers. Therefore, adding the detail about feminism must lower the probability. However, it raises the plausibility. System 1 loves a coherent story, and the description of Linda fits the prototype of a feminist much better than it fits a generic bank teller. We confuse coherence with probability. This leads to a counterintuitive less is more effect. In another experiment, Christopher H.C. asked people to value sets of dinnerware. One group saw a set of 24 intact pieces. Another group saw a set of 40 pieces that included the same 24 intact items, plus several broken ones. Logically, the larger set is worth more because it contains more usable items. Yet, people consistently priced the smaller set higher. This happens because System 1 evaluates based on averages and prototypes, not sums. The broken dishes dragged down the average impression of quality, blinding participants to the total value. Similarly, in the Linda problem, adding vivid details makes a scenario feel richer and more persuasive, even as it becomes mathematically less likely to be true. This persistence of error highlights the inherent laziness of System 2. In the Linda problem, intuition is so powerful that it often overcomes logic, even when the conflicting options are placed side by side. We treat the problem as if we are merely being asked for an opinion, allowing our gut feeling to bypass the rules of probability. This leads us to a major discovery regarding how we process background information, the distinction between statistical base rates and causal base rates. Consider a scenario known as the cab problem. If you are told that 15% of the cabs in a city are blue and a witness claims they saw a blue cab involved in a hit and run, you generally ignore that 15% statistic. It feels like a dry, impersonal fact about the population that has nothing to do with the specific car in question. However, if the information is framed differently, for example, if you are told that green cabs are involved in 85% of accidents, your reaction changes completely. Suddenly, the data feels relevant. You are far more likely to use this information to judge the specific case. Why the difference? Because the second statement implies a cause. It creates a stereotype. Green drivers are reckless. The human mind is hungry for causal stories. We easily digest information that explains why something happened, but we struggle with abstract statistics. When a base rate tells a story, we treat it as a fact about the individual case. When it is just a number, we discard it. This creates a tension between logic and our social norms. While relying on stereotypes might sometimes improve statistical accuracy, we have strong moral reasons to treat people as individuals rather than representatives of a group. Yet, scientifically, ignoring valid stereotypes inevitably leads to errors in judgment. This cognitive blind spot explains why it is so difficult to teach psychology. We simply do not like applying general statistical truths to individual cases. A classic experiment by Richard Nisbett and Eugene Borgida illustrates this perfectly. They investigated the, quote, diffusion of responsibility, showing that when people hear someone having a seizure over an intercom, they are unlikely to help if they believe others are also listening. Most participants just sat there, assuming someone else would handle it. When students are taught the statistics of this experiment, that most nice, normal people will not help, they fail to internalize it. They quietly exempt themselves and their friends from the data, assuming that they would surely step up. The dry statistic does not change their worldview. However, the researchers found a way to break through. Instead of showing the statistics first, They showed the students videos of two specific, pleasant-looking individuals who had failed to help. Seeing these specific people act selfishly shocked the students. Because they were forced to explain the behavior of these specific individuals, they finally accepted the broader truth. This leads to a significant conclusion about human nature. We are unwilling to deduce the particular from the general, but we are remarkably willing to infer the general from the particular. We do not learn by memorizing abstract facts. We learn when a specific story or a surprise in our own behavior forces us to change our minds. One of the most famous examples of this dynamic occurred when Kahneman was teaching flight instructors in the Israeli Air Force. He was explaining a standard psychological principle: rewarding improved performance works better than punishing mistakes. One veteran instructor raised his hand and vehemently disagreed. He told Kahneman, "I have praised cadets for clean maneuvers, and the next time they usually do worse. But when I scream at them for bad execution, they usually do better. So please don't tell me that politeness works and roughness doesn't." The instructor was observing something real, but his conclusion was completely wrong. He had stumbled upon one of the most important yet misunderstood concepts in statistics: regression to the mean. Think about it this way. A cadet's performance is a combination of skill and luck. An exceptionally smooth landing requires skill, yes, but also a bit of good luck with the wind and the controls. By definition, luck is fickle. If a pilot has an amazing flight today, the odds are high that his luck will be just average tomorrow, meaning his performance will naturally dip, regardless of whether he was praised. Conversely, a terrible landing often involves bad luck. The next attempt will likely be better, simply because the bad luck doesn't repeat. Kahneman demonstrated this to the instructors using a simple coin toss game. He showed that people who performed best on the first try almost always did worse on the second, and the worst performers almost always improved. The instructor's screaming didn't fix the cadet. The mathematics of probability did. This reveals a somewhat perverse aspect of the human condition. Because we tend to praise people when they do well and scold them when they do poorly, we are statistically punished for being nice and rewarded for being nasty. We believe our feedback causes the change, but often we are just witnessing the inevitable fluctuation of random processes. This principle applies everywhere. Consider a professional golfer who plays a brilliant round on the first day of a tournament. We can say that success equals talent plus luck. To achieve an extreme score, the golfer needed their usual talent plus an unusual amount of luck. On the second day, their talent remains, but the luck likely regresses to the average. When they shoot a worse score, commentators invent causal stories. They say the player choked or got tense. But usually no physical cause exists. The luck just ran out. This phenomenon was first identified by Sir Francis Galton in the 19th century. He noticed that very large seeds produced offspring that were smaller than themselves, drifting back toward the average size. He called it regression towards mediocrity. Galton realized that whenever the correlation between two things is imperfect, regression must happen. For example, highly intelligent women tend to marry men who are less intelligent than they are. We might invent complex social theories to explain this, but it is a mathematical certainty. Since intelligence between spouses isn't perfectly correlated, an outlier will usually partner with someone closer to the average. The danger is that our minds are built to find causes, not statistical regularities. We see a pattern, like the Sports Illustrated jinx, where athletes fail after appearing on the cover, and we assume the fame ruined their focus. In reality, they made the cover because they were at a peak, and from a peak, the only way to go is down. This blind spot for regression doesn't just explain the past, it wreaks havoc on how we predict the future. Life demands constant forecasting, from guessing how a stock will perform to predicting how a child will do in college. Kahneman distinguishes between two kinds of intuition here. There is the expert intuition of a chess master, born from years of practice and immediate feedback. But most of us rely on heuristic intuition, where System 1 swaps a hard question for an easier one. Consider a classic example. You are told about a young girl named Julie. You learn that Julie read fluently when she was 4 years old. Now, you are asked to predict her college GPA. Instantly, your mind forms an image. Reading at 4 is impressive, perhaps a top-tier achievement. So System 1 automatically matches that intensity. You predict a top-tier GPA. You match the extremeness of the evidence to the extremeness of the prediction. This feels right because it makes a coherent story. Precocious child becomes brilliant adult. But this is a statistical trap. You have ignored the fact that the correlation between reading age and college grades is far from perfect. Many early readers turn out to be average students, just as many late bloomers excel. By matching your prediction directly to the evidence, you are being non-regressive. You are betting that the future will be exactly as exceptional as the past, which is rarely true. System 1 is guilty of what Kahneman calls intensity matching. It looks at how rare the evidence is and assigns a prediction that is equally rare. It ignores the quality of the information. It doesn't ask, how reliable is reading age as a predictor? It just sees what is there. What you see is all there is, and jumps to a conclusion. To fix this, you need to wake up System 2 and perform a disciplined correction. Kahneman suggests a 4-step process. First, establish the baseline. If you knew nothing about Julie, what would you predict? You would guess the average GPA of a graduating senior. Second, make your intuitive prediction, the one based on her reading. Third, estimate the correlation. How much does reading age actually determine GPA? It is likely a low correlation, perhaps 30%. Finally, adjust. You move from the baseline toward your intuition, but only as far as the correlation justifies. If the link is weak, you stick closer to the average. This method produces unbiased predictions, but it comes with a psychological cost. Unbiased predictions are usually moderate. They are boring. They rarely forecast extreme successes or catastrophic failures, because the evidence is rarely strong enough to justify them. If you want the thrill of predicting the next Google or the next global crisis, you have to be willing to be wrong. But if you want to be rational, you must accept that extreme outcomes are difficult to predict, and that the most reasonable guess is usually much closer to the average than your intuition wants to believe. System 1 is not designed for statistical reasoning. It is designed to construct coherent stories. This tendency leads to what Nassim Taleb calls the narrative fallacy. We constantly create flawed, simplified histories of the past to make sense of the world. These stories focus on concrete events, bold actions, and personal talent, while completely ignoring the role of luck and the countless events that failed to happen. Consider the rise of a company like Google. In hindsight, its success looks like a narrative of inevitable triumph, driven by brilliant vision and flawless timing. This story creates an illusion of understanding. It makes us feel that we have learned a valuable lesson about how to succeed. But this sense of understanding is largely a mirage. The narrative ignores the massive influence of chance and the fact that if one or two minor events had gone differently, we might never have heard of the company at all. Because of the rule, what you see is all there is, we build the best possible story from the limited information we have. Paradoxically, it is easier to construct a coherent story when we know very little, because there are fewer inconvenient facts to get in the way. This illusion is reinforced by the language we use. We often say we knew a financial crisis was coming, or we had a premonition that came true. But to truly know something, it must be knowable. If a crisis was unpredictable, claiming you knew it creates a pernicious illusion that the world is tidier than it actually is. This is the essence of hindsight bias, or the "I knew it all along" effect. Once an event occurs, our minds immediately adjust to accommodate the surprise. We lose the ability to recall our previous state of ignorance. The consequences of this bias are significant, leading to outcome bias. We tend to judge the quality of a decision not by the process used to make it, but by its result. If a doctor follows standard procedure but the patient suffers a rare complication, we blame the doctor for negligence. Conversely, if a reckless CEO takes a wild gamble and gets lucky, we crown them with a halo of genius. This rewards risk-seeking behavior and punishes prudent leaders who simply experienced bad luck. This distortion runs rampant in the business world. We love to attribute the success or failure of a firm to the personality of its CEO. If a company is thriving, we describe the leader as flexible and methodical. If the same company starts failing, we describe the same leader as confused and rigid. In reality, the correlation between a CEO's quality and the firm's success is surprisingly low, barely better than random chance. Much of what we attribute to brilliance is simply good fortune, And much of what we call decline is just regression to the mean. Yet we crave causal stories. We reject the idea that regular patterns can be mirages produced by randomness, preferring instead to believe that we can control the future by understanding the past. This phenomenon is rooted in what is known as the illusion of validity. The author illustrates this with a vivid example from his time in the Israeli army. His team was tasked with evaluating officer candidates through a quote-unquote leaderless group challenge, where soldiers had to solve a physical problem like moving a log over a wall without a designated commander. Watching them, the evaluators felt they were seeing the soldiers' true natures revealed. They saw who was stubborn, who was a natural leader, and who was submissive. They crafted coherent stories about each man's future and felt supreme confidence in their predictions. But the reality was humbling. When they later compared their forecasts against the soldiers' actual performance in officer training, their predictions were barely better than blind guesses. Yet, here is the fascinating part. Even after seeing the statistical proof that their evaluations were worthless, their confidence didn't waver. The next time they watched a group carry a log, the sense that they understood the candidates was just as compelling. This teaches us a critical lesson. Subjective confidence is not a reasoned evaluation of probability. It is a feeling that arises from the coherence of the story we've constructed, not the quality of the evidence supporting it. Because of the "what you see is all there is" rule, we substitute a small amount of observed behavior for a complete picture of a person's potential. Nowhere is this illusion more expensive than in the stock market. The investment industry is largely built on the illusion of skill, the belief that professional stock pickers can consistently beat the market. However, decades of research suggest otherwise. In a study of 10,000 brokerage accounts, researchers found that the stocks individual investors sold actually outperformed the ones they bought. Furthermore, the most active traders typically achieved the worst results, leading to the conclusion that trading is hazardous to your wealth. The author conducted his own analysis of 25 wealth advisors at a prestigious firm, examining 8 years of investment returns. He looked for consistency. Did the advisors who did well in 1 year also do well in the next? The correlation was effectively zero. The firm was rewarding luck as if it were skill. When presented with this data, the executives were polite but indifferent. The illusion was too deeply ingrained in their professional culture to be dislodged by mere facts. Why is this illusion so stubborn? It persists because the work itself, analyzing balance sheets and economic forecasts, is genuinely difficult and requires training. This creates a valid experience of using skill, but that skill does not translate into predicting the future in an efficient market. We confuse the complexity of the activity with the validity of the outcome. We prefer the feeling of a coherent story over the cold reality of randomness. A major driver of this overconfidence is hindsight bias. We tend to view history as an orderly march of inevitable events, but this is a delusion. As Nassim Taleb has observed, our ability to construct convincing narratives about the past tricks us into believing we can predict the future. In reality, history is often a series of random accidents. If different eggs had been fertilized at critical moments in the early 20th century, the world today would be unrecognizable. This randomness makes a joke of the idea that long-term developments are predictable. The most devastating critique of expert prediction comes from Philip Tetlock's landmark study of political and economic forecasters. After analyzing 80,000 predictions from nearly 300 experts, Tetlock found that these professionals performed worse than if they had simply assigned equal probabilities to all outcomes, a result famously described as losing to dart-throwing monkeys. Ironically, the most knowledgeable experts were often the least reliable. Tetlock dubbed these thinkers hedgehogs. They view the world through the lens of one single, defining theory. They are confident, articulate, and great for television, but their certainty makes them slow to admit errors. If human intuition is so flawed in these complex, unpredictable environments, what is the alternative? The answer lies in the work of psychologist Paul Meehl. In his book Clinical versus Statistical Prediction, Meehl challenged the sacred cow of expert intuition. He demonstrated that simple statistical algorithms consistently outperform the subjective judgments of trained professionals. Whether predicting student grades, parole violations, or pilot success, the formula wins. Consider the case of Bordeaux wine. For years, experts believed the only way to predict the future price of a vintage was to taste it. Yet, economist Orly Ashenfelter created a simple formula based on just 3 weather variables: summer temperature, harvest rain, and winter rainfall. His calculation predicted prices far more accurately than the palates of world-renowned critics. Why are experts inferior to formulas in these situations? The primary reason is inconsistency. Human judgment is noisy. A radiologist might look at the same X-ray on 2 different days and give 2 different diagnoses, influenced by invisible factors like mood, fatigue, or even hunger. A formula, by contrast, never gets tired and never has a bad day. Given the same inputs, it always delivers the same output. This concept was revolutionized by Robin Dawes, who showed that you don't even need complex mathematics. Simple common-sense models often work best. The most famous example is the APGAR score. Before 1953, doctors used vague clinical judgment to assess newborns, often missing signs of distress. Dr. Virginia APGAR introduced a simple 5-point checklist, checking heart rate, breathing, and muscle tone. This basic algorithm provided a consistent standard that is credited with saving hundreds of thousands of lives. Despite this overwhelming evidence, we remain hostile to algorithms. We have a deep-seated bias for the natural over the synthetic. We view human judgment as holistic and deep, while dismissing formulas as mechanical. When Ashenfelter revealed his wine equation, the experts reacted with hysteria, feeling their craft had been insulted. We prefer to rely on the illusion of human skill, even when a simple checklist would serve us better. This prejudice is magnified in high-stakes scenarios. We tend to find a mistake made by a blind algorithm more emotionally distressing than a human error, even if the machine is statistically safer. We assign more moral weight to a tragedy caused by a formula than one caused by a person. However, the author illustrates that we can overcome this resistance to achieve better results, using a case study from his time in the Israeli Defense Forces in 1955. At the time, the Army's recruitment interviews were almost useless at predicting who would succeed in combat. The interviewers relied on global, intuitive evaluations, which were inconsistent and biased. To fix this, the author replaced those vague impressions with a structured procedure. Interviewers were required to score recruits on 6 specific traits, such as responsibility or sociability, based strictly on factual questions about the recruit's past. Crucially, they had to rate each trait one by one before moving to the next. This was designed to prevent the halo effect, a cognitive bias where a favorable first impression bleeds over into every subsequent judgment. Initially, the interviewers mutinied. They complained that this rigid process turned them into robots and stripped the nuance from their work. A compromise was struck. They would complete the strict scoring first, but then they could provide one final, intuitive rating based on their gut feeling. The results were definitive. The statistical formula was far superior to the old method. But surprisingly, that final close-your-eyes intuitive judgment was also highly accurate, much more so than before. It turned out that intuition works best after you have disciplined it with structured data. This offers a practical blueprint for hiring today. Instead of relying on a general impression, identify a few key traits for the role, create factual questions to assess them, and score each trait independently to avoid bias. Finally, resolve to hire the candidate with the highest score, resisting the urge to invent excuses to pick the person you simply liked more. But if formulas are so good, is there any room left for pure intuition? This question sparked a debate between the author and Gary Klein, a leader in the field of naturalistic decision-making. While the author had spent his career studying how intuition fails, Klein studied how it succeeds in high-stakes fields like firefighting. Through an adversarial collaboration, they sought to define the boundary between skill and luck. They agreed that intuition is not magic. It is recognition. A firefighter knows a floor is about to collapse not because of a mystical sixth sense, but because he recognizes a pattern stored in memory, much like you instantly recognize a friend in a crowd. Klein calls this the recognition prime decision model. The expert's mind retrieves a plausible option based on experience and quickly simulates it to see if it works. However, this only functions if the environment is regular enough to be learned. Chess masters and firefighters develop this skill over thousands of hours, building a library of valid patterns. In contrast, stock pickers operate in a chaotic environment where patterns are illusory. The most critical lesson from their collaboration was that subjective confidence is not a reliable indicator of accuracy. A confident expert might just be telling themselves a coherent story based on limited information. As the author warns, do not trust anyone, including yourself, to tell you how much you should trust their judgment. To determine if an intuition is a genuine skill rather than an illusion, two specific conditions must be met. First, the environment must be sufficiently regular to be predictable. Second, the person must have an opportunity to learn these regularities through prolonged practice. In high-validity environments like chess or anesthesiology, experts develop genuine skill because the rules are stable and feedback is immediate. But in zero-validity environments, like long-term political forecasting, there are no stable patterns to learn. In these fields, successful guesses are usually the result of luck, not expertise. Some environments are even worse than random. They are what the author calls wicked. In these settings, professionals learn the wrong lessons from their experience. Consider an early 20th century physician who believed he could intuitively sense which patients would develop typhoid. He confirmed his hunch by palpating their tongues. His predictions were accurate, but not because of a sixth sense. Since he was not washing his hands between examinations, he was actually the one spreading the disease. His experience reinforced a sense of skill, but his actions were the cause of the outcome. This highlights that expertise is often task-specific, depending entirely on the quality and speed of feedback. A psychotherapist, for instance, receives immediate feedback on whether their words calm a patient in the moment, allowing them to build genuine intuition for short-term interactions. However, they receive almost no reliable feedback on which long-term treatment plans are effective years down the line. Without rapid, unambiguous feedback, true intuitive expertise cannot develop. This disconnect between our internal feelings and statistical reality extends beyond professional expertise into how we plan our own lives. Kahneman illustrates this with a story about a team he led to write a high school curriculum. When he asked the team to estimate how long the project would take based on their current progress, their inside view, they confidently guessed about 2 years. Then Kahneman asked the team's expert to consider the outside view, the historical data of other groups who had attempted similar projects. The reality was grim. 40% of such teams failed to finish at all, and those that did took 7 to 10 years. Despite being presented with this sobering statistical evidence, the team ignored the outside view and proceeded with their optimistic internal timeline. They eventually finished 8 years later. This episode demonstrates the planning fallacy. We naturally adopt the inside view, focusing on our specific circumstances and sketchy plans while ignoring the unknown unknowns, the illnesses, bureaucratic delays, and accidents that inevitably stall progress. We prefer the coherence of our own story over the dry statistics of a reference class. As the author notes, we often display irrational perseverance, choosing to give up rationality rather than give up the enterprise. This tendency to ignore the outside view isn't limited to academic committees. It plagues governments, corporations, and homeowners alike. Consider the construction of the Scottish Parliament building. The initial estimate for the project was £40 million. The final cost was a staggering £431 million. Similarly, studies of rail projects worldwide reveal that 90% overestimate passenger numbers while underestimating costs. Even in our personal lives, the pattern holds. Homeowners remodeling their kitchens typically spend double their original budget. This is the planning fallacy in action. We sketch out a scenario that is unrealistically close to a best-case outcome, assuming everything will go according to plan while ignoring the statistical probability of delays and complications. To combat this, organizational theorist Bent Flivberg proposes a rigorous method called reference class forecasting. It forces planners to look outside their specific situation. The process involves 3 steps. First, identify a reference class of similar past projects. Second, determine the statistical baseline for that class, such as the average cost overrun. And third, use that baseline to adjust the prediction for the current project. This method deliberately suppresses the intuition of the inside view in favor of historical data. Why is this discipline so difficult to maintain? Because the planning fallacy is just one symptom of a pervasive optimistic bias. The author argues that optimism is perhaps the most significant cognitive bias we possess. It serves as the engine of capitalism. Entrepreneurs, inventors, and leaders are almost always optimists. They are the ones who take risks, believing they can beat the odds, and their confidence helps them attract followers and resources. However, this confidence often crosses into delusion. The data on business failure is stark. In the United States, the chance that a small business will survive for 5 years is only about 35%. Yet, when entrepreneurs are asked to estimate their personal odds of success, over 80% believe their chance is 70% or higher. Remarkably, 1/3 of them believe their chance of failure is 0. This gap between reality and perception leads to what the author calls, quote, entrepreneurial delusions. It drives people to persist, and even double down on losses, when objective feedback suggests they should quit. We see this same overconfidence in the corporate world, particularly in what is known as the hubris hypothesis. This concept explains why CEOs frequently engage in mergers and acquisitions that actually destroy value for their own shareholders. These leaders mistakenly believe they can manage the assets better than the previous owners, simply because they are the ones in charge. This blindness stems from a cognitive principle the author calls "what you see is all there is." We focus intensely on our own plans, our own skills, and our own goals, while completely neglecting the competition or the role of luck. This is often referred to as competition neglect. We answer the difficult question, how do I rank against everyone else, with the much easier question, am I good at what I do? It is the same mechanism that leads most people to believe they are better than average drivers. We see our own hands on the wheel and feel our own control, but we fail to account for the chaotic traffic of the world around us. This behavior illustrates a mental shortcut called substitution. When faced with a difficult statistical question like, how do I rank against the average? We unknowingly swap it for a much simpler question, am I a good driver? Or is my business plan solid? The answer to the easy question is usually yes, so we assume the answer to the hard question is also yes. In the business world, this generates a phenomenon known as excess entry. Startups flood into markets that cannot sustain them because every founder looks only at their own good story and ignores the fact that competitors are thinking the exact same thing. While this is often disastrous for the individual, creating what the author calls optimistic martyrs, it actually benefits the economy by signaling new opportunities and driving innovation. This blindness to uncertainty extends to the highest levels of expertise. A study of thousands of forecasts by corporate CFOs revealed that their ability to predict the stock market was practically non-existent. Even worse, they were dangerously overconfident. When asked to provide an 80% confidence interval, a range where they were 80% sure the true number would fall, they were surprised 3 times more often than statistics would predict. Yet, socially, we reward this. We prefer a confident doctor or financial advisor who claims to know the future over one who honestly admits to a wide range of uncertainty. Optimism is hard to correct because it is built into our intuitive system 1, but there is a practical defense, the pre-mortem. Developed by psychologist Gary Klein, this exercise asks a team to imagine it is 1 year in the future, and their project has been a total disaster. They must then write a brief history of how it failed. This simple shift legitimizes doubt and breaks the collective blindness of a group, allowing necessary criticism to surface before it is too late. Understanding these flaws required a fundamental break from traditional economics. For a long time, social science assumed people were econs, rational agents who make consistent, selfish choices based on stable logic. But the author and Amos Tversky studied humans, who are messy, intuitive, and prone to framing effects. To map this territory, they looked at how we handle risk, revisiting the work of Swiss mathematician Daniel Bernoulli. In the 18th century, Bernoulli realized that people do not evaluate gambles based on objective dollar value, but on psychological utility. A gift of 10 ducats means the world to a peasant, but is a triviality to a millionaire. This concept, known as diminishing marginal utility, explained why people are generally risk-averse. We prefer a sure thing over a gamble, even if the gamble has a higher mathematical average, because the psychological value of the next dollar gained is less than the pain of a dollar lost. This insight revolutionized the study of decision-making, yet as we will see, even Bernoulli's elegant model had a blind spot. It assumed that your final state of wealth was the only thing that mattered, ignoring the crucial context of where you started. To illustrate this blind spot, imagine two people, Jack and Jill. Today they each possess a fortune of $5 million. According to Bernoulli's theory, because their wealth is identical, their utility or happiness should be identical. But suppose that yesterday, Jack had $1 million while Jill had $9 million. Today, Jack is ecstatic and Jill is devastated. They have the same bank balance, but their experiences are opposites, because happiness is determined by the change in wealth, not the final state. This missing variable is the reference point. Just as a bowl of tepid water feels hot to a cold hand and cold to a hot hand, financial outcomes are judged against a neutral starting position. This realization led to the development of prospect theory, which is built on three cognitive features of System 1. The first is the reference point we just identified. The second is diminishing sensitivity. The subjective difference between $100 and $200 feels much larger than the difference between $900 and $1,000. The third, and perhaps most significant, is loss aversion. Simply put, losses loom larger than gains. Evolution has wired us to treat threats as more urgent than opportunities. The organism that prioritizes avoiding a predator over finding a berry is the one that survives. In modern financial terms, this means the pain of losing $100 is significantly more intense than the pleasure of winning $100. This asymmetry creates a specific pattern in how we handle risk. When we face options that look like gains, say a sure $500 versus a 50-50 chance at $1,000, we are risk-averse. We lock in the sure thing. But when the same numbers are framed as losses, a sure loss of $500 versus a chance to lose $1,000, we suddenly become risk-seeking. We reject the sure loss and accept the gamble, hoping to escape with nothing lost, even if it risks a larger penalty. It is remarkable that this behavior went unnoticed by economists for nearly 300 years. Kahneman attributes this delay to a phenomenon called theory-induced blindness. Once you have accepted a theory and used it as a tool, it becomes incredibly difficult to notice its flaws. You explain away contradictions rather than questioning the foundation. It took a fresh perspective to see that while Bernoulli's model was elegant, it failed to capture the messy, relative nature of human psychology. For 250 years, scholars ignored these contradictions until economist Matthew Rabin mathematically proved that using the old utility model to explain small-scale decisions is absurd. Rabin demonstrated that if the traditional theory were strictly true, anyone who rejects a small, favorable gamble, like a 50-50 chance to lose $100 or win $200, would be mathematically forced to reject an impossibly massive fortune in a larger gamble. This clearly does not reflect how humans behave, yet the model persisted because economists lacked a better alternative. Prospect theory fixed these errors, but it is not without its own blind spots. For instance, it struggles to account for disappointment. In the model, outcomes are weighed against a reference point, usually the status quo. But if you have a 90% chance to win $1 million and you walk away with nothing, that nothing does not feel neutral. It feels like a loss, because your reference point had already shifted to expecting the money. The theory also overlooks regret, the specific pain that comes from knowing you could have made a different choice that would have led to a better outcome. Despite these imperfections, prospect theory was embraced because it offered something traditional economics could not, a way to explain the, quote, endowment effect. Standard economic theory relies on indifference curves, which assume that your preference for goods, like choosing between more salary or more vacation days, depends only on the state you end up in, not where you started. This ignores the vital role of the reference point. To illustrate, imagine two colleagues, Albert and Ben, who hold identical jobs. The company gives Albert a $10,000 raise and gives Ben 12 extra days of vacation. Standard theory suggests that if these two benefits are of equal value, Albert and Ben should be willing to swap. In reality, they will likely refuse. For Albert, giving up the money to get the time feels like a loss. For Ben, giving up the time to get the money feels like a loss. Because losses loom larger than gains, Both men prefer to stay exactly where they are. This is status quo bias in action. Richard Thaler, a behavioral economist, labeled this the endowment effect. He observed that people often demand a much higher price to sell an object they own than they would ever be willing to pay to acquire it. A wine collector, for example, might refuse to sell a bottle for $100, even though he would never buy that same bottle for $35. The mere fact of ownership increases the item's value in his mind. This was famously tested using coffee mugs. In an experiment, one group of participants, the sellers, were given a mug and asked for their selling price. A second group, the buyers, used their own money to bid on a mug. A third group, the choosers, could simply pick between receiving a mug or a sum of cash. The sellers demanded an average of over $7, while the buyers and choosers valued the mug at around $3. The sellers did not objectively love the mug more, they simply felt the pain of giving it up. Crucially, this effect only applies to goods held for use, like a mug or a concert ticket. It disappears for goods held for exchange, like money or shoes in a shoe store, where trading is the intended purpose and involves no emotional loss. There is, however, another specific demographic for whom the endowment effect does not apply: the poor. For those living below a comfortable reference point, life is a constant series of trade-offs. They do not experience the luxury of holding on to an item just for the joy of ownership, because they are essentially living in the losses. For a person in poverty, spending money is not a choice between a gain and a loss. It is a choice between two losses. Buying a shirt might mean giving up a meal. Because every cost is felt as a painful deprivation, the emotional gap between buying and selling disappears. This intense focus on loss is not just an economic quirk. It is a biological imperative known as negativity dominance. Our brains are hardwired to prioritize bad news over good. Evolutionarily, it was far more important to react quickly to a predator than to notice a tasty piece of fruit. Consequently, neural channels in the amygdala process threatening images, like an angry face, faster than the conscious mind can even register them. This survival mechanism ensures that negativity and the desire to escape always trump positivity and the desire to approach. Psychologist Paul Rosen captured this asymmetry perfectly with a vivid image. A single cockroach will completely ruin a bowl of cherries, but a cherry does absolutely nothing to improve a bowl of cockroaches. Bad is simply stronger than good. This biological wiring has strange effects on our daily behavior, particularly when we set goals. We tend to use goals as reference points, and falling short feels like a loss. Consider New York City taxi drivers. Standard economic logic suggests they should work long hours on rainy days when demand is high and go home early on slow, sunny days to maximize efficiency. Yet, many do the opposite. They set a daily income target, and once they reach it on a busy day, they clock out, viewing any extra work as unnecessary effort. On slow days, however, they grind through grueling hours just to avoid the psychological loss of missing their daily goal. We see the same phenomenon in professional sports. In golf, par serves as the reference point. Analysis of millions of putts reveals that even elite players are significantly more successful when putting to save par than when putting for a birdie. The fear of a bogey, a loss, is a more powerful motivator than the desire for a birdie, a gain. This aversion to loss also explains why negotiations so often stall. When two parties try to reach an agreement, they view their own concessions as painful losses and the other side's concessions as mere gains. Because the pain of giving up ground is felt roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of receiving it, the status quo exerts a magnetic pull. We fight harder to keep what we have than to acquire something new, a tendency that keeps institutions rigid and makes reform incredibly difficult. This instinct to protect established territory extends deeply into our sense of economic fairness. We operate on a principle known as dual entitlement. This rule suggests that both a business and its customers or employees have a right to the terms of their current reference point. For example, if a company cuts a current employee's pay, we instinctively view that as unfair, because it imposes a direct loss on the worker. However, if that same company hires a replacement at a lower market rate, we generally accept it. The new worker has not yet established an entitlement to the previous wage, so no reference point is violated. The rules of fairness are asymmetrical. We generally accept that firms can be selfish when their own survival is threatened. They are allowed to protect their profit margins by passing on losses. However, indignation arises when a firm exploits its power to break informal contracts and increase profits at the expense of others. When these norms are violated, the consequences are real. Customers who feel a merchant has acted unfairly will often punish them by withholding future business, even at a cost to themselves. Brain imaging studies reveal that this altruistic punishment actually activates the pleasure centers of the brain. We derive biological satisfaction from enforcing social norms, acting as the glue that holds economic society together. This distinction between losses and gains is so fundamental that it is written into our legal systems. The law frequently distinguishes between actual losses and foregone gains. For instance, a merchant might be compensated for goods that were destroyed in transit, but rarely for the profits they would have made if the goods had arrived. Psychologically and legally, losing what you already possess is far more significant than failing to gain something new. This psychological weighting also distorts how we evaluate risk and probability. Standard economic theory relies on the expectation principle, which assumes that the value of a gamble is simply the value of the outcome multiplied by its probability. In this rational view, a 5% increase in your chances of winning is always worth the same, whether your odds are rising from 0 to 5% or from 60 to 65%. But human psychology does not follow straight lines. We are heavily influenced by the possibility effect and the certainty effect. When the probability of a positive outcome moves from 0 to 5%, the qualitative shift is massive. It creates hope. This leads us to overweight small probabilities, which explains the enduring popularity of lotteries. We pay far more than the mathematical value of the ticket just for the right to dream. At the other end of the spectrum is the certainty effect. Moving from 95% to 100% has a psychological impact that far exceeds the mere 5% statistical difference. We will pay a huge premium to eliminate that last sliver of risk to achieve total peace of mind. This creates a complex, fourfold pattern of preferences. We are risk-averse when facing high-probability gains, preferring a sure thing over a gamble. Yet, we become risk-seeking when chasing low-probability gains. Conversely, regarding losses, we are willing to pay expensive premiums for insurance to eliminate the fear of unlikely disasters, overweighting the small risk of a catastrophe because the peace of mind is so valuable. This brings us to the fourth and final corner of the pattern, which is perhaps the most dangerous: high-probability losses. Imagine you are facing a 95% chance of a significant financial loss. The alternative is to accept a slightly smaller loss for certain. A rational calculation suggests you should cut your losses and take the sure hit, but humans are not rational calculators. In this situation, the pain of a sure loss is so intense that we become risk-seeking. We reject the guaranteed bad outcome and instead embrace a desperate gamble, hoping for that slim 5% chance that we might escape with nothing lost at all. This behavior explains why failing businesses often spend their last remaining assets on risky, long-shot strategies, or why armies continue to fight long after defeat is inevitable. The thought of accepting a large, sure loss is simply too painful to bear, so we double down, often making the final outcome much worse. These instincts, overweighting small chances of winning and small chances of disaster, reveal that our brains do not handle rare events well. We tend to oscillate between ignoring them entirely or giving them massive, disproportionate weight. This is largely due to the, quote, possibility effect. When an event is vivid and emotionally charged, the mere fact that it could happen dominates our decision-making, rendering the actual probability irrelevant. Terrorism is a potent example of this. Statistically, the risk to any individual in a Western country is vanishingly small. However, the images of such attacks are horrific and easily accessible to our memory. This creates an, quote, availability cascade. The constant media coverage and social conversation make the threat feel immediate and omnipresent. System 1 triggers an automatic emotional alarm that System 2 cannot easily suppress. Because the fear is real, we assign a high decision weight to the risk, leading us to pay a premium for security measures that may not align with the statistical reality. This intense focus on specific, vivid outcomes also distorts our optimism. This is known as the focal event bias. When we think about a plan, a business venture, or a sports team, our attention narrows to the specific scenario where things go right. Success is a coherent, easy-to-imagine story. Failure, by contrast, is diffuse. There are 1,000 different, unrelated ways a plan can fall apart, and because they are hard to visualize all at once, we tend to ignore them. This is the root of the planning fallacy. Entrepreneurs and investors overestimate their chances of success because they are fixated on the clear path to victory, while the messy, complex possibilities of failure remain hidden in the background. This tendency to fixate on a clear, emotional story doesn't just affect our long-term plans, it fundamentally breaks our ability to calculate risk in the moment. In standard economic theory, a 10% chance is weighted exactly as the math dictates, but in reality, we are incredibly insensitive to probability when the outcome is vivid or emotional. Research shows that if you face a threat like an electric shock, your fear response is triggered almost entirely by the possibility of the shock, not the probability. Whether the chance is 10% or 90%, the fear feels roughly the same. The mere idea of the event overwhelms the statistics. This is true for positive outcomes as well. If a reward is rich in emotional detail, like a romantic encounter or a specific, desirable object, we focus on the image and neglect the odds. Even adding irrelevant but vivid details, such as describing money being delivered in a, quote, large blue cardboard envelope, can make an outcome feel more certain, disrupting our ability to think mathematically. This mental glitch leads to a bias known as denominator neglect. We tend to focus on the number of times an event happens, the numerator, while ignoring the total size of the group, the denominator. Consider a choice between two urns. Urn A contains 10 marbles and 1 is a winner. Urn B contains 100 marbles and 8 are winners. Mathematically, Urn A offers a 10% chance, while Urn B offers only 8%. Yet many people instinctively choose Urn B. Why? Because seeing 8 winning marbles creates a more hopeful, vivid image than seeing just 1, even though the odds are worse. System 1 latches onto the winners and ignores the pile of losers surrounding them. This explains why the format of information changes our reaction to it. A risk described as 0.001% feels abstract and small, but if you describe that same risk as 1 out of 100,000 children, the mind instantly conjures an image of that one specific child. The emotional impact spikes. In studies, people judged a disease that kills 286 out of 10,000 as more dangerous than one that kills 24%, even though the latter is twice as deadly. The frequency format makes the victims visible to System 1. This is a common tool in persuasion. Prosecutors might use percentages to make a risk seem abstract, while defense attorneys use frequencies to make a, quote, 1 in 1,000 error feel like a tangible, frightening possibility. Our perception of risk also depends on whether we are reading about it or living it. When we make a choice from description, such as reading about a lottery or a vaccine's rare side effects, we tend to overweight the unlikely events because the text draws our attention to them. However, in choice from experience, learning through daily life, we often do the opposite. We underweight rare events simply because we haven't seen them recently. If you have never personally experienced a major earthquake or a financial crash, those risks carry almost no weight in your daily decisions until the moment they happen. This inconsistency is compounded by our tendency toward narrow framing. We look at decisions in isolation, one at a time, rather than viewing them as a portfolio of risks. This was famously illustrated by Paul Samuelson, who offered a friend a coin toss bet, lose $100 or win $200. The friend refused, saying the pain of losing $100 was too great. But he admitted he would take the bet if he could play it 100 times in a row. He understood that while one toss is risky, the aggregate of many tosses is a statistical winner. Unfortunately, because we live life one moment at a time, we are naturally narrow framers, paying a premium for safety in small decisions that cost us dearly in the long run. To escape this trap, you need to adopt the perspective of a trader. A rational trader knows that while one specific gamble might fail, a portfolio of similar decisions will eventually pay off. This is the magic of aggregation. By broadening your frame, you can see that a single risky bet is just one small part of a lifetime of financial choices. The author suggests a specific mantra to help neutralize the emotional sting of loss. You win a few, you lose a few. When you view a loss not as a tragedy, but as a recurring cost of doing business, your physiological response to that loss is actually blunted. This has immediate practical applications for investors. If you check your stock portfolio every day, you are engaging in narrow framing. You will see small fluctuations, and because losses sting twice as much as gains feel good, frequent checking leads to emotional distress and useless churning of your assets. The solution is simple but difficult. Check your results less often, perhaps once a quarter. This enforces a broad frame, reducing the pain of short-term volatility and improving your long-term returns. Another powerful tool for broad framing is the adoption of risk policies. Instead of agonizing over every decision to buy an extended warranty or choose an insurance deductible, establish a standing rule. For instance, a policy of always taking the highest deductible, or never buying the warranty, might cost you money on a bad day, but it will save you a fortune over a lifetime. This is the outside view in action, ignoring the specifics of the current situation to focus on the statistics of a class of similar cases. This tension between narrow and broad views often plays out in organizations. Consider a scenario where 25 division managers are each offered a risky gamble with a high expected return. Individually, they might all refuse, fearing the impact of a loss on their own track record. However, the CEO, who views the company broadly, would want all of them to accept, knowing that the aggregate result is a near certain win. Unfortunately, our natural tendency is to keep score using mental accounts. We treat money not just as currency, but as a proxy for our own achievement. This leads to the disposition effect in investing, where people sell winning stocks too early to lock in the pleasure of a win, while holding on to losing stocks to avoid closing the mental account with a loss. This desire to avoid the emotional pain of admitting failure also drives the sunk cost fallacy. We throw good money after bad into failing projects, simply because we have already invested in them. This is why a new CEO is often the only one who can cancel a failing project. Unlike their predecessor, they carry no mental account burdened by past mistakes. This psychological burden is closely tied to one of our most powerful emotions, regret. Regret is what psychologists call a counterfactual emotion. It arises when we compare our actual reality to an alternative reality that we can easily imagine. The easier it is to undo an event in your mind, the more intense the regret becomes. This is where the concept of normality plays a crucial role. We feel much worse when a bad outcome results from an unusual action rather than a routine one. Imagine two men who are both robbed while picking up a hitchhiker. The first man picks up hitchhikers frequently. It is part of his routine. The second man never does it, but made an exception just this once. Who feels more regret? Almost everyone agrees it is the second man. Because his action was abnormal, it is painfully easy for him to imagine the scenario where he simply followed his usual habit and drove on. He broke his own default, and that deviation creates the sting. This dynamic explains a fundamental rule of human psychology, the asymmetry between action and inaction. Generally, we expect to feel more regret if we crash while trying to change lanes than if we crash while staying in our lane. Consider two investors, Paul and George. Paul considers selling a stock, but decides to keep it. George holds the same stock but decides to sell it and buy a different one. Both men end up losing the same amount of money. Logically, their financial loss is identical, but psychologically, George feels much worse. Paul failed by doing nothing, an error of omission. George failed by doing something, an error of commission. Because George deviated from the default option, his failure feels more personal. This fear of regret drives us toward conventional behavior. In the marketplace, consumers stick to well-known brands because buying a generic product that fails carries the extra weight of, "I should have known better." In medicine, physicians often stick to standard treatments even when a new, unconventional method might work better. If the standard treatment fails, it is viewed as unfortunate. If the unconventional one fails, the doctor faces not just regret, but blame for being reckless. This emotional machinery can even distort our sense of justice. When we judge cases in isolation, what researchers call single evaluation, we rely heavily on System 1 and its emotional intensity. If we hear about a man shot in a store he rarely visits, we feel a pang of poignancy. If only he had gone to his usual shop, we think. Consequently, juries often award higher compensation to victims of unusual events, simply because the counterfactual is so vivid. However, when we see cases side by side in joint evaluation, System 2 takes over. We realize that the location is irrelevant to the severity of the injury, and the logical inconsistency disappears. We are often blind to these inconsistencies because, in daily life, we experience events one at a time, rarely having the luxury of a side-by-side comparison. We are governed by the rule that what you see is all there is, leaving our judgments at the mercy of our immediate emotional reactions. This narrow focus explains a phenomenon that shook the foundations of economic theory: preference reversal. For decades, economists assumed that human preferences were stable and coherent. That if you preferred apples to oranges today, you would not suddenly swap that preference just because the fruits were presented differently. But psychologists Sarah Lichtenstein and Paul Slovic proved otherwise with a simple experiment involving two bets. Imagine you are offered bet A, which gives you a small chance to win a large sum, like $160. Then there is bet B, which offers a very high chance to win a modest sum, like $40. When asked to choose between them, most people prefer the safety of bet B. However, when the same people are asked to set a minimum selling price for each bet in isolation, they consistently place a higher price on bet A. In the first case, you choose safety. In the second, you focus on the potential $160 payout, because that large number anchors your judgment. This inconsistency violated the coherence doctrine of economics, proving that we are not rational agents with fixed preferences, but humans whose choices depend entirely on context. This happens because our judgments are bound by categories. System 1 automatically evaluates things relative to a norm. For instance, if you see a 5-foot-tall 6-year-old, you think, that is a very tall child. If you see a 5'1" 16-year-old, you think, that is a very short teenager. In isolation, your emotional reaction is determined by how the subject compares to its specific category. It is only when you place them side by side that you recognize the 16-year-old is objectively taller. Christopher Hesse dubbed this the evaluability hypothesis. He demonstrated it by asking people to value two second-hand dictionaries. One was like new but had only 10,000 entries. The other had 20,000 entries, but a torn cover. When viewed alone, people valued the pristine book more because a torn cover is an obvious defect, whereas the number of entries is just a number with no context. But, in joint evaluation, the superiority of the 20,000 entry dictionary became obvious, and the torn cover was dismissed as a minor cosmetic flaw. These reversals have serious implications for the administration of justice. Jurors and legislators often evaluate cases in isolation, which allows System 1 to dominate. For example, if you are asked to donate to a cause saving dolphins, you might give generously because dolphins are charming and rank high in the category of animals. If asked to donate to a fund for farm workers with skin cancer, you might give less because compared to other public health crises, it feels less urgent. However, when the two causes are presented together, the human versus animal feature becomes salient and preferences flip. In the legal system, this lack of a broad frame can lead to incoherent penalties. A jury might award massive punitive damages against a bank for a financial error simply because the bank's size provides a high numerical anchor, while awarding a smaller sum to a victim of physical injury because pain has no dollar value to anchor on. As the author notes, when we view cases in isolation, our justice system is often infected by predictable incoherence. It is only by broadening the frame, forcing System 2 to compare cases side by side, that we reach more reasonable, consistent decisions. Neuroeconomics provides a physical map for this mental struggle. When researchers observe the brain during these decision-making tasks, they see distinct patterns. When a person's choice conforms to a suggested frame, the amygdala, a region associated with emotional arousal, lights up. This confirms that System 1 is reacting immediately to emotionally charged words like keep or lose. Conversely, resisting a frame requires effort. It activates the anterior cingulate, an area linked to conflict and self-control. The most rational subjects, those who remain reality-bound regardless of the phrasing, show enhanced activity in the frontal area, suggesting they are successfully integrating emotion with reasoning to quiet their internal conflict. You might assume that experts, armed with training and experience, are immune to these shifts. They are not. In one study, physicians were asked to evaluate a surgery. When the outcome was described as having a 90% survival rate, the procedure was popular. When described as having a, quote, 10% mortality rate, popularity dropped significantly. Logically, the two statements are identical, but emotionally, they are worlds apart. Survival is good. Mortality is bad. Because reframing requires mental energy and System 2 is naturally lazy, even doctors often passively accept the emotional valence of the words they are given. This vulnerability extends to our moral intuitions. Economist Thomas Schelling demonstrated this with a puzzle about tax codes. If you ask people whether the rich should receive a larger tax exemption for having children than the poor, most say no. They want to favor the poor. But if you reframe the question to ask if the childless poor should pay a larger surcharge than the childless rich, people also say no. Mathematically, you cannot have it both ways. The contradiction arises because our moral compass is often attached to the description of the problem rather than the mathematical reality. We react to the frame, not the substance. We see this same blindness in public policy and consumer behavior. Consider the MPG illusion. Most people intuitively feel that upgrading a car from 30 to 40 miles per gallon is a significant improvement. However, upgrading a gas guzzler from 12 to 14 miles per gallon actually saves far more fuel over the same distance. Our intuition fails because miles per gallon is a misleading frame. If we calculated gallons per mile, the reality would be obvious. Perhaps the most striking example of framing involves the power of defaults. In European countries, organ donation rates vary wildly, from nearly 100% to as low as 12%. This is not due to culture or religion, but simply the design of the form. In countries where you must check a box to opt out, almost everyone stays in. Where you must check a box to opt in, almost everyone stays out. This falsifies the theory of the rational agent. We do not make consistent choices based on deep preferences. Often, we simply accept the default because it is the path of least resistance. This leads us to a fundamental disconnect in how we view satisfaction. Kahneman introduces a distinction between decision utility, what we want when we make a choice, and experienced utility, how we actually feel while living through the outcome. Ideally, the rational agent would ensure that what we want, decision utility, matches what we enjoy, experienced utility. But in practice, they often diverge completely. We frequently make choices that fail to maximize our actual well-being because of a fundamental conflict between two aspects of our identity, the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self is the one living through the moment. It answers the question, does it hurt right now? It feels every second of pleasure or pain. The remembering self, however, is the one that keeps score. It answers the question, how was it, on the whole? Crucially, the remembering self is the one that makes future decisions, and it does not care about the total amount of time you spent in a state of bliss or agony. It cares about the story. Kahneman illustrates this with a study of patients undergoing colonoscopies. Patient A had a short procedure, just 8 minutes, but it ended at a moment of high pain. Patient B had a procedure that lasted 24 minutes, 3 times as long, but the pain subsided gradually toward the end. If you were to calculate the total amount of suffering, patient B clearly endured more. Yet when asked later, patient A remembered the experience as much worse. This reveals two quirks of the human mind: the peak-end rule and duration neglect. Our memories are not like video recordings. They are snapshots. We rate an experience based on the average of its most intense moment, the peak, and how it ended. The total length of the experience, or duration, is largely ignored. Because patient B had a better ending, the remembering self recorded a gentler story, effectively erasing the extra minutes of suffering. This leads to irrational choices. In the cold hand experiment, participants were subjected to 2 painful trials involving freezing water. One was short, the other was long but ended with a slight warming. When asked which trial they would repeat, the vast majority chose the longer, more painful option. They volunteered for unnecessary suffering because their remembering self preferred the trial with the better ending. This happens because System 1 represents experiences as prototypes or averages, not as a mathematical sum. It cannot intuitively calculate the area under the curve of total utility. This bias extends to how we evaluate entire lives. In one experiment, adding 5 moderately happy years to a very happy life caused people to rate the person's total happiness as lower. The average quality of the life story went down, so the perceived value went down, even though the total amount of happiness increased. This less is more effect suggests we view life as a narrative to be edited, rather than a continuous stream of time to be experienced. We plan vacations to create memories and take photos, often sacrificing moment-to-moment comfort for the sake of a better retrospective story. To illustrate just how dominant this perspective is, consider a thought experiment proposed by the author. Imagine you are offered a luxury vacation, fully paid for, with every detail tailored to your desires. There is just one catch. At the end of the trip, all your photographs will be destroyed, and you will swallow a potion that wipes every memory of the vacation from your mind. Would you still go? For many people, the elimination of the memory destroys the value of the experience entirely. This reveals a startling truth. We often prioritize the remembering self over the experiencing self. We are remarkably indifferent to the real-time sensations of the self that actually does the living, treating it almost like a stranger, as long as the story we get to keep is a good one. This disconnect creates a problem for measuring well-being. Most happiness research relies on surveys that ask people how satisfied they are with their lives. These questions address the remembering self, but to understand the quality of our actual existence, we need to look at experienced well-being, the quality of moments as they are lived. To capture this, researchers developed the day reconstruction method. Participants break their previous day into film-like episodes and relive the feelings associated with each. This allows scientists to calculate the U-index, which measures the percentage of time an individual spends in an unpleasant state. The data from these studies offers a clear lesson. Happiness is largely a function of how you spend your time and what you pay attention to. For example, while temperament provides a baseline for your mood, your immediate environment dictates the moment-to-moment experience. Commuting and working often rank high in unpleasantness, while socializing ranks low. Crucially, we only derive pleasure or pain from what we are attending to at that moment. In one comparison, French women reported more pleasure from eating than American women, largely because the French tended to focus entirely on the meal, whereas the Americans often diluted the experience by multitasking. This framework also provides a nuanced answer to the age-old question, does money buy happiness? The data suggests that it depends entirely on which self you ask. When we look at life evaluation, the story the remembering self tells, higher income is consistently associated with a better rating. However, when we look at experienced well-being, the joy or stress felt on a typical Tuesday, the picture changes. Poverty acts as a misery multiplier, amplifying the pain of misfortunes like illness or loneliness. But once a household reaches an income of roughly $75,000, the benefits of additional money on daily emotional experience vanish. Beyond this satiation level, higher income does not improve your mood, even if it continues to improve your opinion of your life. One reason for this may be that wealth reduces our ability to savor small pleasures. Studies show that simply priming people with the idea of wealth reduces the physical enjoyment they derive from eating a piece of chocolate. Ultimately, when we try to assess how happy we are, System 1 often takes a shortcut. Instead of performing a complex calculation of our life's total utility, it answers an easier question, such as, what is my current mood? In one famous experiment, subjects who found a dime on a photocopy machine reported significantly higher life satisfaction than those who did not. Our global evaluations are often determined by a small sample of highly available and sometimes completely irrelevant events. This reliance on heuristics extends far beyond finding loose change. It profoundly influences how we anticipate and evaluate major life events, such as marriage. When couples get married, they often expect a permanent shift in their happiness. The data, however, tells a different story. There is indeed a significant spike in life satisfaction around the time of the wedding, a honeymoon effect. but it eventually recedes and satisfaction levels typically return to their previous baseline. Why does this happen? It is not necessarily that the marriage becomes unhappy, rather it becomes routine. When newlyweds are asked to evaluate their lives, the marriage is fresh and salient, so it dominates their answer. But for a couple married for a decade, the relationship is simply a background fact of life. Their moment-to-moment happiness, their experienced well-being, depends more on immediate factors like work stress, traffic, or household chores than on their marital status. This discrepancy highlights a cognitive bias the author calls the, quote, focusing illusion. The core insight can be summarized in a single sentence. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it. Consider the common belief that moving to a better climate will make you happier. In a study comparing residents of California and the Midwest, both groups predicted that Californians would be significantly more satisfied with their lives due to the weather. Yet, the results showed no difference in actual life satisfaction between the two groups. The error stems from the "what you see is all there is" bias. When you imagine living in California, you focus entirely on the sun and the beach. You forget that the vast majority of your life is spent working, commuting, and sitting indoors, activities that feel roughly the same regardless of the weather outside. The focusing illusion creates a trap known as miswanting. We make bad choices because we exaggerate the long-term impact of a single purchase or change. We imagine that a new luxury car will provide constant joy. In reality, you only derive pleasure from the car when you are actively thinking about it. As you drive it day after day, your mind wanders to other things, and the car fades into the background, much like the fact that you have 10 toes. It is a nice reality, but not one you constantly celebrate. We adapt to almost everything that remains constant. This even applies to severe adversity. While we assume conditions like paraplegia ruin one's life forever, the data suggests that after a period of adjustment, people adapt. They withdraw attention from their physical limitations and focus on work, relationships, and entertainment. The only exceptions are conditions that demand continuous attention, such as chronic pain, loud noise, or severe depression. In these cases, the mind cannot adapt because the stimulus refuses to be ignored. This discrepancy between what we endure and how we interpret it leads to choices that can seem manifestly absurd. In the famous cold hand study, participants actually chose to repeat a longer period of pain simply because the experience ended with a slightly lower level of discomfort. This creates a better memory, even if the total suffering was greater. The author notes that while time is our ultimate finite resource, the remembering self ignores duration entirely. We prioritize a good ending over a good experience. Consequently, we are prone to miswanting, frequently selecting options that do not actually improve our lived experience. This friction between the experiencing self and the remembering self challenges the foundation of traditional economics. Standard economic theory assumes that people are econs, rational agents who are logically consistent and always make decisions in their best interest. In reality, we are humans. We are not irrational in the sense of being impulsive or stubborn, but we do not fit the rational agent model. We are susceptible to biases, framing effects, and the laziness of System 2. This distinction has fueled a shift away from the strict Chicago school of thought, which insists that individuals should be entirely free to choose without interference, assuming they will choose correctly. Instead, behavioral economics proposes libertarian paternalism. This approach suggests that institutions can nudge people toward better decisions without restricting their freedom. A prime example is the power of the default option. Because humans tend to stick with the status quo to avoid the mental effort of making a change, setting enrollment in a pension plan as the default drastically increases savings rates. Another successful application is the Save More Tomorrow plan, which asks employees to commit to saving a portion of their future raises. This strategy works because it aligns with our psychological quirks. It avoids the pain of immediate loss and uses our natural inertia to ensure long-term consistency. Governments are increasingly adopting these methods, ensuring that disclosures are clear and that the choice architecture helps humans who, unlike econs, need assistance to navigate complex decisions. Ultimately, understanding the mind requires recognizing the continuous interaction between our two modes of thinking. System 1 is the origin of our intuition and most of what we do right, allowing us to navigate the world efficiently. However, it is also the source of systematic errors. It offers confident answers even when it lacks genuine skill, often substituting a hard question for an easier one. Because System 2 is often too lazy to scrutinize these intuitions, we frequently endorse biased suggestions without realizing it. Correcting these biases is difficult because System 1 operates automatically and provides no warning signal when it is unreliable. Since it is hard for individuals to catch their own errors in the heat of the moment, organizations play a vital role. By treating decision-making as a manufacturing process, using tools like checklists, reference class forecasting, and pre-mortems, groups can enforce quality control. A crucial part of this process is developing a precise vocabulary for our biases. When we can name an error, such as anchoring or narrow framing, we are better equipped to spot it. As the author concludes, richer, more precise gossip at the water cooler is the first step toward better decisions in the boardroom. To sharpen that vocabulary, the authors provide a closer look at the specific mental shortcuts, or heuristics, that guide our judgment. While these intuitive leaps are often useful, they lead to systematic errors that are as predictable as optical illusions. One of the most common is the representativeness heuristic. This occurs when we judge the probability of an event based entirely on how much it resembles a stereotype, while ignoring the actual statistical odds. Consider a man named Steve, described as shy, helpful, and orderly. If asked whether Steve is more likely to be a librarian or a farmer, most people instantly say librarian. He fits the profile perfectly. However, this judgment ignores the base rate, the simple fact that there are far more farmers in the general population than librarians. Even when we have no relevant information about a person, we tend to use base rates correctly. But the moment we hear a description that matches a prototype, we discard the statistics entirely. Our intuition also fails when it comes to sample size. We tend to believe that a small sample of data should perfectly mirror the larger population. But this is a fundamental error. In a famous example involving a large hospital and a small hospital, subjects were asked which facility would more likely record days where over 60% of the babies born were boys. Most people guessed the probability was the same for both. In reality, a large sample is stable. It stays close to the 50-50 average. A small sample is much more likely to show extreme deviations. By ignoring sample size, we often view random fluctuations as meaningful patterns. This misunderstanding extends to our view of chance itself. We expect randomness to look orderly. If a coin flips heads 5 times in a row, we feel that tails is due to restore the balance. This is the gambler's fallacy. Nature does not keep a tally to correct imbalances. Deviations are not corrected. They are merely diluted as the sequence continues. Perhaps the most counterintuitive stumbling block is the phenomenon known as regression to the mean. In any series of events where luck plays a role, an extreme performance is typically followed by a more average one. Because we lack an intuition for this, we invent causal stories to explain the change. A classic example involves flight instructors who noticed that when they praised a pilot for a perfect landing, the next landing was usually worse. Conversely, when they screamed at a pilot for a terrible landing, the next attempt improved. They concluded that punishment was effective and praise was dangerous. They were wrong. The pilots were simply regressing to their average skill level. The instructors were victims of a statistical illusion, learning the unfortunate lesson that they were rewarded for punishing others and punished for rewarding them. Beyond these statistical illusions, our minds also rely on shortcuts to estimate how often things happen. This is known as the availability heuristic. Essentially, we judge the frequency or probability of an event by how easily we can recall instances of it. While this is often a useful clue, since common things are usually easier to remember, it leads to predictable errors, because memory is influenced by factors other than mere frequency. Consider the impact of familiarity and salience. If you are asked to judge the frequency of a class of people, seeing a list of famous names will make that class seem larger than a list of strangers, simply because the famous names are easier to retrieve. Similarly, seeing a house fire in person has a much bigger impact on your subjective probability of fires than merely reading a statistic in the newspaper. Recency matters too. Driving past an overturned car temporarily inflates your assessment of traffic risks, even if the statistical reality hasn't changed. This bias extends to how we search through our mental libraries. For example, if asked whether more words start with the letter R or have R as their third letter, most people confidently guess the former. Why? Because it is much easier to search your vocabulary for words beginning with a letter than to scan for letters in the middle. In reality, R is more common in the third position, but our mental search engine favors the first. This reliance on ease of retrieval also affects risk assessment. If we can vividly imagine a specific disaster, we overestimate its likelihood. Conversely, if a danger is hard to visualize or abstract, we tend to underestimate it, regardless of the actual data. Another pervasive mechanism is anchoring. When we make estimates, we often start from an initial value, an anchor, and adjust away from it. The problem is that these adjustments are almost always insufficient. In one striking experiment, subjects were shown a random number from a Wheel of Fortune and then asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Those who saw a high random number gave significantly higher estimates than those who saw a low one. Even though they knew the number was meaningless, they could not completely ignore the anchor. This phenomenon explains why we struggle with complex probabilities. When planning a project that requires many steps to go right, known as a conjunctive event, we anchor on the high probability of each individual step succeeding. We fail to adjust enough for the fact that the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, leading to unwarranted optimism in scheduling. On the flip side, in complex systems like a nuclear reactor where failure happens if any single part breaks, a disjunctive event, we anchor on the low probability of a single component failing. We underestimate how likely it is that something in the vast system will go wrong. The result is a consistent tendency to be overconfident in our plans and complacent about systemic risks, a calibration gap that persists even among experts. This persistent overconfidence raises a troubling question. Why don't we learn from experience? We live in a world of data, yet most of us fail to intuitively grasp fundamental principles like regression toward the mean or the impact of sample size. The reason is that we do not naturally code the information we encounter in a way that highlights these statistical rules. For example, we might read a page of text without ever noticing that the average word length varies more in individual lines than on the page as a whole. We simply do not attend to those specific averages, so we never learn the lesson. The same blindness applies to our own judgment. To realize you are poorly calibrated, for instance, discovering that things you are 90% sure of only happen 50% of the time, you would need to keep a systematic tally of your predictions. Since nobody groups unrelated events by their probability in daily life, these systematic errors remain invisible. This leads to a critical distinction in decision theory between coherence and rationality. You can be internally coherent, meaning your beliefs do not contradict one another while still being irrational. A gambler who believes a run of heads makes tails more likely is acting consistently with his own beliefs, but he is incompatible with the laws of physics. True rationality requires more than just internal consistency. It requires compatibility with the real world. These judgment errors usually stem from the three primary heuristics we have discussed: representativeness, availability, and anchoring. While these mental shortcuts are economical and often effective, they lead to predictable mistakes. This tension between how we should act and how we actually act is central to the study of decision-making. Historically, theorists like Daniel Bernoulli argued that people make choices based on the final state of their wealth, a concept known as utility. Bernoulli correctly noted that utility is a concave function. The first $1,000 you earn matters more to your well-being than the next 1,000. This explains why people are generally risk-averse. They prefer a sure gain over a gamble with a slightly higher mathematical expectation. However, modern prospect theory refines this view. It argues that we do not evaluate outcomes based on total wealth, but rather as gains and losses relative to a reference point, usually the status quo. This creates a distinct S-shaped value function. In the domain of gains, we remain risk-averse. But in the domain of losses, the curve flips. We become risk-seeking, often accepting a bad gamble just to avoid a sure loss. Furthermore, the curve is steeper for losses than for gains, a phenomenon known as loss aversion. Psychologically, the pain of losing $100 is far more intense than the pleasure of winning $100. This dependency on reference points makes us vulnerable to framing effects. Consider a scenario where you must choose a strategy for an outbreak expected to kill 600 people. If told that a certain strategy will save 200 lives, most people choose it. If told the same strategy means 400 people will die, most reject it in favor of a gamble. The math is identical, but the frame changes our preference. This violates the logical rule of invariance, which states that equivalent choices should yield the same answer. Since our intuition cannot be trusted to maintain this consistency, the only defense is to deliberately frame every significant problem in multiple ways to see if your answer shifts. Ideally, to maintain logical consistency, we would view every financial decision in terms of our total assets, a canonical representation of wealth. But our minds are not built for such comprehensive calculations. We are too limited by our intuitive computational power. Therefore, we rely on narrower frames, leaving us susceptible to the quirks of how we perceive chance and value. Consider how we process probability. We do not weigh risks linearly. A 5% increase in the chance of winning means something very different depending on where you start. Moving from 0 to 5% creates the possibility effect, transforming an impossibility into a hope. Moving from 95 to 100% creates the, quote, certainty effect, eliminating all anxiety. These changes carry immense psychological weight. In contrast, a shift from 30 to 35% is mathematically identical but feels psychologically negligible. This nonlinearity distorts our decisions. We tend to overweight low probabilities, which explains the allure of lottery tickets and the fear of rare, catastrophic events. Conversely, we underweight moderate and high probabilities. This bias makes us crave the total elimination of risk rather than a mere reduction. We will pay a premium for a policy that offers full protection against a specific danger, yet we often reject probabilistic insurance that reduces overall risk by half, even if the math is in our favor. We are seduced by the feeling of certainty. This compartmentalization extends to how we handle money itself, a concept Richard Thaler calls mental accounting. According to economic theory, money is fungible. A dollar is a dollar, regardless of its source or intended use. But in practice, we organize our spending into, quote, topical accounts. Imagine you are buying a calculator for $15. You learn that a store 20 minutes away sells it for $10. Most people would make the drive to save the $5. Now, imagine you are buying a jacket for $125, and the other store sells it for $120. The savings are identical, $5 for 20 minutes of effort, yet most people would not drive for the discount on the expensive item. In the first case, the savings feel huge relative to the price. In the second, they feel trivial. We see this same logic in the famous theater ticket problem. If you arrive at a theater and realize you have lost a $10 ticket you previously purchased, you are unlikely to buy another one. Your mental theater account has already been debited, and spending $20 for one show feels excessive. However, if you arrive and realize you have lost a $10 bill from your wallet, you will likely still buy a ticket. The loss of cash is charged to your general wealth, not the specific cost of the movie. These mental accounts are reinforced by loss aversion, leading to the endowment effect. We value things more simply because we own them. Giving up an asset feels like a loss, which is more painful than the pleasure of acquiring it. This creates a powerful status quo bias, where we prefer to keep things as they are rather than risk a trade-off, effectively paralyzing us in our current state simply because it is the reference point we know. This reliance on a reference point explains why the distinction between a loss and a cost is so critical to our behavior. In standard economic theory, money is a neutral medium of exchange. A dollar is a dollar, but psychologically, framing a negative outcome as a cost rather than a loss makes it far more palatable. For example, people are generally willing to pay a premium for insurance because they view it as the cost of protection. However, if that same financial hit is framed as a sure loss in a gamble, they will often take risky bets to avoid it. We accept payments much more readily than we accept losses. This aversion drives what is known as the dead loss effect, often called the sunk cost fallacy. Imagine a person who has paid a non-refundable membership fee for a tennis club, but then injures their elbow. They might continue to play through the pain, not because they are enjoying the tennis, but because stopping would force them to recognize the fee as a, quote, dead loss. By playing, they attempt to mentally amortize the cost, even if the experience itself is physically agonizing. They are prioritizing the avoidance of regret over their immediate well-being. This behavior highlights a major discrepancy in human psychology, the gap between decision value and experience value. Decision value is how attractive an option looks when we are making a choice. Experience value is how we actually feel when living through the consequences. We tend to assume these two will match, that we want what we will enjoy, but we are notoriously poor forecasters of our own future feelings. One reason for this prediction error is the, quote, hedonic treadmill. We adapt to new circumstances much faster than we anticipate. We might believe a salary raise will permanently increase our happiness, but in reality, we quickly adjust to the new income level, and the emotional boost fades. We also suffer from state-dependent errors. For instance, we buy too much food when we are hungry, forgetting that our appetite is temporary. To understand why these miscalculations occur, we must look at the machinery of the mind itself. The brain's operations can be described as a partnership between two distinct characters, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the fast, automatic, and intuitive mode of thinking. It operates with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control, like reading a billboard as you drive past. System 2 is the slow, deliberate mode. It handles effortful mental activities, like complex calculation or focusing on a specific voice in a crowded room. While we identify with System 2, the conscious, reasoning self, it is actually the lazy partner in the relationship. Mental effort is a physiological cost. When you concentrate hard, your heart rate increases and your pupils dilate, acting almost like a mental electricity meter. Because attention is a limited resource, the brain follows the law of least effort. If there are several ways to achieve a goal, we naturally gravitate toward the least demanding course of action. Consequently, we often let the intuitive, impulsive System 1 run the show, relying on shortcuts and emotional heuristics rather than engaging the energy-expensive machinery of System 2. This reliance on shortcuts often manifests as a process called substitution. When faced with a difficult, complex question, the mind instinctively swaps it for an easier, related one without you even noticing the switch. For example, if asked to evaluate a political candidate's complex policy history, you might unknowingly substitute the easier question, does this person look like a strong leader? You answer the second question, but you believe you have answered the first. This is frequently guided by the affect heuristic, where our judgments are driven simply by our emotional likes and dislikes rather than raw data. But why doesn't our conscious self, System 2, step in to correct these errors? The answer lies in the physical nature of willpower. Cognitive effort is hard work. When you are forced to exercise self-control or focus on a demanding task, you draw from a limited pool of mental energy, leading to a state known as ego depletion. This is not merely a metaphor. It is a biological reality often linked to blood glucose levels. When your energy is drained, your ability to control your impulses plummets. The consequences of this depletion can be startling. In one study analyzing parole rulings, researchers found that judges were significantly more likely to deny parole requests when they were tired or hungry. Immediately after a food break, approval rates spiked, only to drop steadily to near zero as their blood sugar and mental energy fell. When the brain is low on fuel, it defaults to the path of least resistance, rejecting the parole request, which is the safer, status quo option. While System 2 is resting or depleted, System 1 is busy building a coherent picture of the world through associations. It functions as an associative machine. This leads to priming, a phenomenon where exposure to one idea unconsciously triggers a cascade of related concepts and influences your behavior. This happens entirely outside of your awareness. In a famous demonstration of the ideomotor effect, young people who arranged sentences using words associated with the elderly, such as forgetful, gray, or Florida, subsequently walked down the hallway significantly slower than those who had not seen those words. The mere idea of old age acted on their bodies, even though they did not consciously notice the theme. The brain also constantly monitors for cognitive ease. If information is presented clearly, using a simple font, high contrast, or rhyming language, we experience a sense of fluency. The brain interprets this ease as evidence of truth. This creates an illusion of truth, where repeated statements feel factual simply because they are familiar. Familiarity signals safety to the primitive brain, while cognitive strain signals a need for vigilance. Consequently, when we are in a good mood or the environment feels familiar, we let our guard down, becoming more intuitive and creative, but also more gullible. We are, in essence, machines for jumping to conclusions, prioritizing a coherent, easy-to-digest story over complex, verified accuracy. One of the most powerful mechanisms driving this behavior is the anchoring effect. When we are exposed to a number, even one that is completely irrelevant, it acts as a mental tether. If asked to estimate a value, we start at that anchor and adjust away from it, but the adjustment is rarely sufficient. This is why a limit of 12 per person sign at a supermarket causes shoppers to buy more cans of soup than they otherwise would. The number 12 primes the mind, pulling the purchase quantity upward. We also rely heavily on the availability heuristic, judging the frequency of an event by how easily examples come to mind. Crucially, it is the fluency of retrieval that matters, not the actual data. If you struggle to recall instances of your own assertiveness, you will likely conclude you are unassertive, simply because the mental effort felt difficult. This reliance on ease and emotion extends to how we assess risk. Through the affect heuristic, our likes and dislikes determine our beliefs. If we favor a particular technology, we intuitively assume its benefits are high and its risks are low. As the psychologist Jonathan Haidt describes it, emotion wags the rational dog. Our logical mind often acts merely as a press secretary, justifying the conclusions our feelings have already reached. This preference for coherent stories over dry statistics leads to predictable errors in judgment. We are prone to the conjunction fallacy, famously illustrated by the Linda problem. When presented with a description of a woman named Linda who is concerned with social justice, people often guess it is more probable that she is a, quote, feminist bank teller than simply a bank teller. Logically, a specific subset can never be more likely than the broader category it belongs to, but the detailed story feels more representative of her character. So we ignore the math. We are causal thinkers, not statistical ones. We invent elaborate reasons for why a star athlete has a sophomore slump, or why a company falters after a successful year, ignoring the reality of regression to the mean. Extreme performance naturally drifts back toward the average, but our minds reject the role of chance, preferring a narrative about talent or failure. This blindness to statistics creates an illusion of validity, particularly in the financial world. Investors and fund managers often believe they possess superior skill, even when the data shows their performance is indistinguishable from rolling dice. In many fields, from wine pricing to medical diagnosis, simple algorithms actually outperform human experts. Formulas are consistent, whereas human judgment is noisy and easily swayed by irrelevant factors like fatigue or hunger. Yet, we resist these mechanical aids because we trust our gut. This overconfidence culminates in the planning fallacy. When starting a project, we adopt the inside view, focusing on our specific plans and hopes. We ignore the outside view, the statistical reality of how similar projects have fared in the past, leading us to consistently underestimate costs and timelines while overestimating success. This distortion is frequently compounded by the sunk cost fallacy. Once we have invested time, money, or effort into a project, we often refuse to cut our losses, choosing instead to throw good money after bad to justify our initial expenditure. We become trapped by our past decisions rather than focused on our future prospects. Yet this same overconfidence acts as the primary engine of capitalism. Economic activity is often driven by what can be described as the triumph of hope over experience. Entrepreneurs and inventors tend to be far more optimistic than the average person, frequently believing that the high failure rates of their industries simply do not apply to them. This leads to competition neglect, where individuals focus so narrowly on their own capabilities that they ignore the playing field. For instance, sellers might crowd into a market at peak hours, unaware that the presence of so many competitors drastically reduces their chances of success. While this optimism can lead to personal financial ruin, it is essential for overall economic dynamism. To understand how we evaluate the risks and rewards of these ventures, we must look back to the history of economic thought. For centuries, the Standard Model relied on the work of Daniel Bernoulli. He revolutionized the field by proposing that the value of money, its utility, is relative, not linear. A $10 million loss is catastrophic for someone with only $10 million, but a mere annoyance for a billionaire. Bernoulli correctly identified that our satisfaction depends on the ratio of the gain or loss to our existing wealth. However, Bernoulli's model contained a critical flaw that persisted for nearly 300 years. It assumed that people make decisions based solely on the final state of their wealth. It ignored the reference point, the status quo from which we start. In reality, we do not think in terms of total assets. We think in terms of gains and losses relative to where we are right now. This insight is the cornerstone of prospect theory, which introduces the concept of loss aversion. Put simply, losses loom larger than gains. The psychological impact of losing $100 is significantly more intense than the pleasure of winning $100. Research suggests the loss aversion ratio is typically between 1.5 and 2.5, meaning we need a potential gain to be roughly twice as large as a potential loss before we are willing to take a risk. This asymmetry is hardwired into our biology. Our brains are designed to prioritize threats. The amygdala can process a frightening image before our visual cortex even fully recognizes what it is. In survival terms, avoiding a predator is more urgent than finding a meal. Bad is stronger than good. This aversion to loss explains the endowment effect, a phenomenon where we value an object more highly simply because we own it. In standard economic theory, the price you are willing to pay for a good should be the same as the price at which you would sell it. But in practice, ownership changes everything. If you hold a ticket to a major sporting event, giving it up feels like a painful loss, so you demand a much higher price to sell it than you would ever pay to buy it. This creates sticky markets where fewer trades occur than theory predicts, because owners demand a premium to part with their possessions. Interestingly, this effect disappears among those living in poverty. For the poor, every dollar spent is already a trade-off, a loss of one necessity to buy another, so they remain constantly aware of the opportunity costs that wealthier people often ignore. Beyond ownership, our inability to think statistically extends to how we perceive risk. When faced with rare events, our minds often skip the math and focus entirely on the story. This is called probability neglect. If a risk is described vividly, like a terrorist attack or a shark bite, we obsess over the worst-case scenario, ignoring how unlikely it actually is. This distortion is amplified by something known as denominator neglect. If you are told a disease kills 1 in every 1,000 people, you instinctively imagine that one victim, and the danger feels real. But if you are told the mortality rate is 0.1%, the emotional impact fades, even though the math is identical. We also compartmentalize our money and our mistakes, a habit known as mental accounting. Logic suggests that money is fungible. A dollar is a dollar, but we do not act that way. This leads to the sunk cost fallacy. Imagine you have paid for a ticket to a play, but on the night of the show, a dangerous blizzard strikes. A rational person would stay home to stay safe. But because you have already opened a mental account for that ticket, you might drive through the storm just to avoid the feeling of wasting the money. You risk your life to justify a past expense that is already gone. This fear of regret drives us to stick to the norm. We feel far worse if things go wrong after we take an unusual action than if we fail while doing what everyone else does. This is why doctors might prescribe a brand-name drug over a generic, or why investors hold on to losing stocks too long. Sticking to the default protects us from the sting of self-blame. Perhaps the most profound insight in this section of the book is the distinction between our two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives in the present, feeling pleasure or pain moment by moment. The remembering self, however, is a storyteller that keeps the score. Crucially, the remembering self does not care about how long an experience lasted, a phenomenon called duration neglect. Instead, it follows the peak-end rule. We judge an entire vacation or a medical procedure based on just two things: the most intense moment, or the peak, and how it ended. A long, mostly pleasant holiday can be ruined in your memory if the flight home is a nightmare. This duality complicates how we measure happiness. When researchers ask about life satisfaction, people evaluate their achievements, and here, money matters. Satisfaction rises steadily with income. But if you ask about emotional well-being, the quality of a person's daily mood, the story changes. In high-cost areas, emotional happiness rises with income only up to about $75,000 a year. Beyond that, more money buys better life ratings, but it does not buy more daily joy. We often miss this distinction because of the focusing illusion. We think a new car or a move to California will change our lives, because when we think about them, we focus only on that one change. But in reality, we adapt, and the new car eventually becomes just another part of the background.
I hope you enjoyed this summary of the book. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps a lot. And if the summary caught your interest, you can find a link in the description to buy the full book and dive deeper into its ideas. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did you like this format? What would you change or improve for future summaries? See you in the next video.